For 700 years, the Indian Ocean was the center of the world, not metaphorically, literally. The goods that furnished the courts of China, the temples of India, the palaces of Persia, and the merchant houses of East Africa all moved across the same water, carried by the same seasonal winds, governed by the same commercial laws, spoken in the same trading languages. Pepper from the Malabar coast reached Cairo. Chinese porcelain reached Kilwa, on the coast of what is now Tanzania. Gold from Zimbabwe passed through Arab hands in Zanzibar before it ever reached the Mediterranean. Cotton, silk, ivory, frankincense, iron, tin, and timber, all of it moving, season after season, across an ocean that connected half the planet into a single, breathing system of exchange. There was no emperor who commanded it, no navy that enforced it, no capital that administered it. It ran on wind, on trust, and on 7 centuries of accumulated commercial intelligence, and it was the most sophisticated economic system the world had yet produced. Most people have never heard of it. The version of history that reached the West begins the story of global trade with the European voyages of the 15th century, with Columbus crossing the Atlantic, with Vasco da Gama rounding the Cape of Good Hope, with a handful of Iberian sailors cracking the world open for the first time. That story is not entirely wrong, but it is missing something enormous. When da Gama anchored off Calicut in 1498 and presented his gifts to the ruler of that city, 4 scarlet cloaks, 6 hats, some coral beads, a cask of honey, the merchants in the room were not impressed. They had been running the Indian Ocean trade network for 500 years. They looked at what he had brought and concluded, not unreasonably, that he was a pirate. Da Gama had not discovered a route to a hidden world. He had arrived, uninvited, into one that had been there all along, and what happened next is a story that has been almost entirely left out of the history we were taught. Every ocean is a problem. Water does not move on command. Wind is not guaranteed. A sailor who sets out across open sea without knowing what the air will do is gambling with cargo, crew, and life in a single throw. Most of the world's oceans presented exactly this kind of uncertainty, variable, treacherous, and deeply unforgiving of error. The Indian Ocean was different. The Indian Ocean had a secret, and for the merchants who knew it, that secret was worth more than any cargo they could carry. The secret was the monsoon. Twice a year, the wind system over the Indian Ocean reverses completely. Between April and September, the southwest monsoon drives steadily from the African coast toward India and Southeast Asia. Between November and February, the northeast monsoon turns the whole system around, blowing back from the Indian subcontinent toward Arabia and East Africa. The pattern repeats, season after season, century after century, with a reliability so absolute that generations of sailors built their entire commercial lives around it. It was not luck. It was physics, and once you understood it, the ocean stopped being a barrier and became a road. What this meant in practice was something that no other body of water in the world could offer: a guaranteed return journey. A merchant who loaded his dhow in Aden in November and caught the northeast monsoon to the Malabar coast of India knew, with confidence that bordered on certainty, that the southwest monsoon would carry him back to Arabia by summer. He could plan. He could commit to contracts. He could borrow money against a cargo that had not yet been bought, because the timeline was as predictable as the seasons themselves. Risk, the great enemy of commerce across all of history, collapsed in the face of a wind that never lied. The ancient maritime guides knew this with extraordinary precision. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a merchant's handbook written in the 1st century CE by a Greek-speaking trader out of Roman Egypt, listed the departure windows for each major route along the Indian Ocean. Not in months, but in weeks. A captain sailing for the pepper ports of the Malabar coast from the Red Sea knew exactly when to leave to catch the seasonal wind at full strength. That knowledge passed from captain to apprentice, from father to son, accumulating over centuries until the sailing calendar of the Indian Ocean was one of the most precisely mapped systems of practical knowledge in the ancient world. The vessel that the monsoon built was the dhow. There is no single design. The word covers dozens of hull types across the western Indian Ocean, from small coastal fishing craft to ocean-going merchant ships capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo. What they shared was the triangular lateen sail, cut and rigged to catch wind from the side rather than only from behind. This made the dhow far more maneuverable than a square-rigged vessel. It could work across the wind and, in skilled hands, even make progress against it. The dhow was not built for the open Atlantic, where a ship needed to fight unpredictable seas in any direction. It was built for the Indian Ocean, a vessel shaped to a specific wind system, refined over 1,000 years of use. The hull itself told a story about the ocean it sailed. Until the arrival of European ships in the late 15th century, dhows along the East African and Arabian coasts were built without a single iron nail. The planks were sewn together with core-twisted rope made from coconut husks, threaded through thousands of holes bored by hand, and sealed with a mixture of lime and tree gum. The choice was not poverty. Iron nails corroded in salt water, and a corroded fastening weakened faster than rope. A well-maintained sewn dhow lasted 60 years. A nailed hull lasted 10 before the fastenings needed replacing. The ocean had taught its shipbuilders what worked, and they had listened. The monsoon did something else that no map or guide could fully capture. It created communities. A merchant who sailed from Oman to Zanzibar in December arrived with the northeast monsoon at his back. He had to wait until July for the southwest monsoon to carry him home 7 months in a foreign port. In those 7 months, he learned the language, settled disputes in local courts, established credit with local brokers, and often took a wife. His children grew up bilingual, belonging to both worlds. Across the Indian Ocean, in port after port from Mogadishu to Calicut to Malacca, this pattern repeated itself for centuries, producing hybrid communities that were neither fully Arab nor fully Indian, nor fully African. They were something the monsoon had made. A single wind system, reversing twice a year over a warm ocean, was the physical engine behind 7 centuries of connected civilization. Every port city, every merchant dynasty, every legal norm and shared language and cross-cultural marriage that made the Indian Ocean world what it was, all of it rested on the monsoon. The network did not build the wind. The wind built the network. The Indian Ocean trade network that this story is primarily concerned with, the great 700-year system that connected East Africa to China and governed itself without kings or armies, emerged in recognizable form around the 8th century CE. But the ocean it was built on had been carrying trade for far longer than that. The medieval merchants who refined this system were heirs to something ancient. To understand what they built, it helps to know what was already there when they arrived. 4,000 years before the birth of Islam, ships were already crossing the Arabian Sea. The Harappan civilization, which occupied the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, during its peak between 2600 and 1900 BCE, maintained a maritime trading world that extended from the river cities of Mesopotamia to the ports of the Persian Gulf and back again. Harappan merchants carried carnelian beads, copper ingots, cotton textiles, and the distinctive ivory combs and carved seals that their craftsmen produced. Their goods moved through Dilmun, the island trading hub of ancient Bahrain, where Gulf merchants handled the exchange between the Indus world and the cities of Sumer and Akkad. At the quays of Akkad, the Akkadian ruler Sargon boasted that ships from Meluha, the Mesopotamian name for the Indus lands, tied up alongside vessels from Magan and Dilmun. The Indian Ocean was already a commercial world when Europe was still in the early Bronze Age. Further east and further back still, a different maritime tradition was taking shape. The Austronesian peoples, originating in the islands of what is now Taiwan and the Philippines, were developing something the world had not seen before: a seafaring technology capable of crossing open ocean in any direction. Their vessels carried a double outrigger, a lateral float on each side of the hull that prevented capsizing in rough water. The design gave stability without sacrificing speed. With it, Austronesian sailors moved outward across the Pacific in one direction and westward across the Indian Ocean in the other, colonizing islands no other human beings had yet reached. The scale of what they accomplished is worth holding for a moment. Austronesian sailors from the islands of Southeast Asia, almost certainly from the Borneo region, crossed the Indian Ocean and reached the island of Madagascar, off the eastern coast of Africa. The crossing covered roughly 4,000 miles of open water with no intermediate landfall. They made it without instruments, navigating by stars, ocean swells, and the flight patterns of birds. They planted their language and their crops, including Asian bananas and taro, on an African island, and their descendants remain the core population of Madagascar to this day. This was not exploration in the European sense, driven by royal commission and national ambition. These were peoples who simply knew the ocean well enough to cross it, and did. The same Austronesian maritime world was almost certainly responsible for what ancient Mediterranean sources called the cinnamon route, a commerce in spices, particularly cinnamon and cassia, that connected Southeast Asia to East Africa and the Middle East centuries before Greek or Roman sailors understood where cinnamon actually came from. Roman writers believed cinnamon grew in Arabia. In fact, it came from Sri Lanka and the Indonesian archipelago, and it reached the Mediterranean through Indian and Southeast Asian intermediaries who had no interest in revealing the source. The Indian Ocean was already protecting its commercial secrets long before the medieval network formalized what secrecy was worth. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was deeply embedded in Indian Ocean trade and spending heavily for the privilege. Roman merchants sailed from Red Sea ports like Berenice and Myos Hormos, timing their departures to catch the southwest monsoon across the Arabian Sea to the pepper ports of the Malabar coast. The Greek-speaking merchant who wrote the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea around 60 CE produced a detailed guide to the entire western Indian Ocean, distances between ports, the character of local rulers, the goods available at each stop, and the items most likely to be accepted in exchange. It was a working document, written by someone who had made the voyage himself. Roman coins, gold ore, and silver denarii turned up at ports all along the Indian coast, testimony to how much Rome spent on pepper, ivory, and silk, and how little it had to offer in return that Indian merchants actually wanted. The Aksumite kingdom, centered in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, controlled the western approach to the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea for several centuries around the turn of the first millennium CE. Aksum minted its own gold coinage, one of only 3 states in the world at that time to do so, alongside Rome and Persia, and its merchants moved between the African interior, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian coast. Ivory from the African highlands passed through Aksumite ports and into the Persian Gulf trade. The kingdom's wealth was inseparable from its position on the sea road. When Aksum eventually declined, it left behind a Red Sea corridor that others would exploit, Arab merchants above all. But the infrastructure of Indian Ocean connection through East Africa had been in place for centuries before Islam arrived to transform it. All of this, the Harappan commerce, the Austronesian crossings, the Roman pepper trade, the Aksumite Red Sea kingdom, was the inheritance that the medieval Indian Ocean network built upon. The merchants and port cities and legal systems that made the great network work did not invent Indian Ocean trade. They systematized it. They gave it institutions, shared languages, and a scale it had never previously reached. But the ocean they worked on had been in motion for 4,000 years before the first Arab dhow caught the monsoon wind south toward Zanzibar. What came next was not a beginning. It was a transformation. When Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE, it spread into a world that was already commercial. The Arab peoples of the Hejaz had been caravan traders long before the Prophet's birth. Mecca itself was a trading city, a hub of the annual fairs that connected the Arabian interior to the Red Sea and the wider world beyond. The Prophet Muhammad had worked as a merchant in his youth, managing caravans for the widow Khadijah, whom he later married. Commerce was not an activity Islam had to reconcile itself with. It was part of the world the faith was born into, and it shaped what Islam, from the beginning, understood commerce to be. The Quran spoke directly and positively about trade. It condemned usury, the lending of money at exploitative interest, but did not condemn profit. The distinction mattered enormously. Across the legal traditions of the ancient Mediterranean, trade had often occupied an ambiguous moral position, associated with deception and greed. In Islamic jurisprudence, a merchant who dealt honestly was not a figure of moral suspicion. He was following a path the Prophet himself had walked. That framing gave Muslim commerce a legitimacy it held in no other major civilizational system of the time, and it had practical consequences that echoed across 7 centuries of Indian Ocean trade. Islamic law did something that no political empire could fully accomplish. It standardized commercial behavior across an enormous geography. The schools of Islamic jurisprudence, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, disagreed on theology and ritual, but their treatment of commercial contracts was remarkably uniform. The rules governing partnerships, debt, agency, and profit sharing were consistent whether a merchant was operating in Basra, Aden, Calicut, or Zanzibar. A trader who had learned commercial law in one city could enter a market on the other side of the Indian Ocean and operate within a legal framework he already understood. This was not a minor convenience. It was the institutional foundation on which long-distance trust became possible. The central financial instrument of the Islamic commercial world was the qirad, a partnership contract in which one party supplied capital and another supplied labor and skill. An investor in Cairo could entrust gold to a merchant bound for the Malabar coast. The merchant traded with it, covered his own expenses from the proceeds, and returned a pre-agreed share of the profit to the investor. If the voyage failed through no fault of the merchant's, the investor bore the loss. The merchant bore only his time. The arrangement separated the risk of capital from the risk of labor in a way that made long-distance trade accessible to people who could not otherwise afford to send a ship across the Arabian Sea. The qirad was so effective that it later reached medieval Italy through the Islamic commercial network, where Venetian and Genoese merchants adopted it under the name commenda and built their own fortunes on it. Arabic functioned as the Latin of commerce across the entire Indian Ocean world. It was not the mother tongue of most Indian Ocean merchants. Gujarat traders spoke Gujarati, Swahili merchants spoke Kiswahili, Persian merchants spoke Farsi. But Arabic was the language of the Quran, and because Islamic law governed commercial contracts from Morocco to Indonesia, Arabic was the language in which those contracts were written, witnessed, and enforced. A bill of exchange, a partnership deed, a letter of credit, all of these moved through the network in Arabic. A merchant who could read and write Arabic had access to the entire commercial infrastructure of the Islamic world, regardless of where he was born or what he spoke at home. The Muslim dinar, a gold coin of consistent weight and purity, minted across the Abbasid Caliphate from the late 7th century onward, provided the network with a common currency that functioned wherever Islamic commercial law reached. Local currencies circulated in local markets, but long-distance transactions were denominated in dinars. A shipment of pepper bought in Calicut could be priced in the same unit as the silk sold in Cairo or the ivory moving through Aden. The dinar did not require a single political authority to enforce its value. Merchants enforced it themselves by refusing to accept debased coins. It was a currency backed not by a king, but by collective commercial practice, and that made it both more durable and more widely trusted than any purely political currency of the era. From the middle of the 8th century, the Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad sat at the center of the most extensive commercial network the world had yet seen. Baghdad was not merely a political capital. Under caliphs like Harun al-Rashid, it was the world's largest city, a place of 500,000 inhabitants, with a merchant quarter that handled goods from China and spices from the Malabar coast and gold from sub-Saharan Africa. The Abbasid administration actively promoted trade. It maintained roads, subsidized caravanserais, standardized weights and measures, and created legal infrastructure that merchants from across the Islamic world could rely on. By the 11th century, when Cairo began to eclipse Baghdad as the commercial hub, the system was already so deeply embedded that the shift of its center did not break it. The network was more resilient than any single city within it. What Islam had produced, in effect, was a civilizational operating system for commerce. The shared law, the shared language, the shared currency, the shared ethical framework around honest dealing, these were not decorative features of Muslim merchant culture. They were the infrastructure. They allowed a Yemeni investor to trust a Gujarati agent he had never met, because both men operated within the same legal and moral framework, and both knew what the consequences of betrayal would be. Trust at that scale, across those distances, between people of different ethnicities and mother tongues, required more than personal reputation. It required institution. Islam provided the institution. The Indian Ocean provided the wind. Together, they built a world. The instrument of that world's expansion was not the army. Arab Muslim merchants who settled in port cities along the East African coast, in Gujarat, in Ceylon, in the trading cities of Southeast Asia, did not arrive with soldiers behind them. They arrived with goods. They built mosques and married local women. Their children grew up bilingual and bicultural, belonging to both the host society and the wider commercial network. When local rulers converted to Islam as they did, over time, across the Swahili coast, across much of India's western shore, and eventually across much of Southeast Asia, the motivation was rarely purely spiritual. Islam opened doors. A ruler who adopted the faith gained access to the legal and commercial infrastructure of the Islamic merchant world, and with it, access to the most sophisticated trading system on the planet. The reach of this system was staggering. By the 10th century, Arab merchants had settled in the ports of southern China. Chinese ceramics moved westward through the network and appeared on the tables of Swahili city-state elites. East African ivory reached the workshops of Fatimid Cairo. Indian pepper arrived in Venetian markets after passing through a dozen Muslim hands. The Islamic commercial network was not a chain of discrete bilateral transactions. It was a genuine system, self-reinforcing, self-regulating, and capable of distributing goods and wealth across half the circumference of the earth, without any central authority directing the flow. That absence of central authority was both the network's great strength and, in time, its great vulnerability. Strength, because no single political collapse could bring it down, and political collapse was frequent in the medieval Islamic world. The destruction of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258 was catastrophic for the Abbasid Caliphate, but the Indian Ocean trade network absorbed the shock and continued. Individual nodes could be destroyed. The system, distributed across dozens of port cities and thousands of merchant partnerships, could not be so easily eliminated. Vulnerability, because when a power arrived that was willing to use military force not to tax the network, but to seize it entirely, there was no collective defense. The network had no army. It had never needed one. For 7 centuries, that had been enough. What the Islamic framework created, in the end, was the first genuinely global commercial culture, not global in the sense that every part of the world participated, but global in the sense that it operated by shared rules across an enormous geography, and that its logic was recognizably modern. Credit, partnership, agency, profit sharing. Dispute resolution by agreed law rather than by force. These are not primitive commercial practices. They are the architecture of every market that has existed since. The Indian Ocean world built them 7 centuries before anyone in Europe imagined it was possible. The East African coast runs for more than 2,000 miles from the Horn of Africa, southward, to Mozambique. For most of its length, it is a coast of islands, estuaries, and natural harbors, a geography designed, or so it seems in retrospect, for maritime trade. The ocean lies to the east. The African interior, with its enormous reserves of gold, ivory, iron, and timber, lies to the west. Standing between the two, from at least the 8th century CE onward, were the cities of the Swahili coast, independent, Muslim, cosmopolitan, and fabulously wealthy by any standard the medieval world had available to measure wealth. The Swahili people were not a single ethnic group. They were what the ocean made of a long encounter between Bantu-speaking Africans, who had been farming and trading along this coast since the 1st century CE, and Arab and Persian merchants who began settling permanently among them from around the 8th century onward. The word Swahili comes from the Arabic Sawahil, meaning people of the coast. The language they spoke, Kiswahili, carried that history in its grammar, Bantu at its grammatical core, Arabic in hundreds of its commercial, religious, and administrative words. A Swahili merchant's vocabulary was an archive of the civilizations that had met on this shoreline. The settlements that emerged from this encounter were unlike anything else in the medieval world. They were not African kingdoms in the traditional sense. They had no surrounding agricultural territories to tax, no armies of conquest, no hinterland populations to govern. They were commercial cities, pure and simple. Their wealth derived entirely from their position at the intersection of two economic worlds, the ocean trade coming in from Arabia, Persia, and India, and the interior trade flowing down from the African plateau. The cities governed themselves, usually through a sultan and a council of wealthy merchant families. Power in a Swahili city-state was, at its root, commercial power. By the 10th century, dozens of these city-states studded the coast, Mogadishu in the north, Mombasa and Malindi in what is now Kenya, Pemba, Zanzibar, and Kilwa on the islands of what is now Tanzania, Sofala, far to the south, at the limit of the monsoon's reliable reach. Each city was politically independent. They competed fiercely with one another for trade, but all of them operated within the same cultural and commercial world, spoke the same language, practiced the same faith, and maintained the same dense web of commercial relationships with partners across the Indian Ocean. Together, they formed the western anchor of the entire network. What the Swahili coast sold to the Indian Ocean world was Africa. Gold, above all the gold of Great Zimbabwe and the Zimbabwean Plateau, mined in the interior and carried on foot and by river down to the coast. Ivory from the elephant herds of the interior, prized in India for carving and in China for the handles of luxury goods. Iron, timber, mangrove poles, the dense, salt-resistant wood of the coastal forests that the treeless Arabian Peninsula needed to build, ambergris, tortoiseshell, animal hides. All of it moved through Swahili hands, taxed at each port, enriching the merchant families who controlled the routes. In return, the Swahili cities imported what Africa could not produce. Cotton cloth from India. In enormous quantities, a single cargo ship from Gujarat might carry enough cotton to clothe the entire population of a coastal city. Chinese porcelain, which the Swahili merchant class used not merely as tableware, but as a marker of status and sophistication. Glass beads, which functioned as currency across the African interior. Silk and spices from the eastern end of the network. These imported goods did not stay on the coast. Swahili merchants moved them inland along the river routes, trading them at the great seasonal fairs on the Zimbabwean plateau for more gold, more ivory, more of the raw materials the ocean wanted. The coast was a membrane, not a terminus. Kilwa Kisiwani, on a small island off the coast of what is now southern Tanzania, was at its peak in the 13th and 14th centuries, the most important commercial city in sub-Saharan Africa. Its position was geographic destiny. It sat at the southernmost point that a dhow from the Arabian Peninsula could reach and still return home in the same monsoon season. All the gold coming up from Sofala had to pass through Kilwa. The Sultan understood this and taxed it accordingly. The revenue built the palace of Husuni Kubwa, a sprawling complex of more than 100 rooms, built of coral stone overlooking the channel, incorporating architectural elements drawn from Abbasid Iraq and decorated with Chinese porcelain embedded in its walls. When the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Kilwa in 1331, he described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. He had seen Cairo, Damascus, and Delhi. He knew what he was comparing it to. The Swahili cities had also become the first urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa to mint their own coinage. Kilwa's copper coins circulated across the coast, and deep into the interior copper coins bearing a Kilwa Sultan's name have been found at sites on the Zimbabwean plateau, tracking the commercial reach of a single island city across hundreds of miles of continent. The coins were not merely currency. They were a statement that this city operated by rules, that its merchants could be trusted, that its sultan's word on the weight and purity of a coin was worth accepting. Minting coin was an act of institutional ambition, a claim to be taken seriously as a commercial power in a world where commercial credibility was the only power that mattered. The Swahili coast was also where Africa entered the Islamic world, not as a subordinate periphery, but as a full participant in a shared commercial and religious civilization. Mosques rose in the 9th century and expanded in the 10th and 11th as the merchant class grew wealthier. Converting to Islam was, for the Swahili elite, simultaneously an act of faith and a commercial decision. It brought them inside the legal and cultural framework of the Islamic merchant network, gave them access to the Arabic contracts and the Qurad partnerships and the Muslim dinar, and marked them as trustworthy counterparts to the Arab and Persian traders who arrived with the monsoon every year. The faith and the commerce were inseparable. In the Swahili world, they had always been. Inland from the coast, the consequences of Swahili commerce reached further than the gold itself. The kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, a stone-walled city on the plateau of what is now Zimbabwe, to home at its peak to perhaps 18,000 people, owed its scale and sophistication, in part, to its position as the primary source of gold for the Kilwa trade. Imports from the Indian Ocean reached Great Zimbabwe through Swahili intermediaries. Glass beads from Persia, porcelain from Song Dynasty, China, cotton cloth from Gujarat. A civilization that most Western historical education has treated as peripheral was, in fact, integrated into the most sophisticated commercial network on Earth. The world was not waiting to be discovered. It was already connected. The Swahili world was not without its internal tensions. The city-states competed aggressively. Kilwa's rise came partly at the expense of Mombasa, whose sultans resented the southern city's domination of the gold trade. There was rivalry over port revenues, over access to interior routes, over the terms of trade with Indian and Arab merchants, whose ships they needed but could not control. The political structures of individual cities were vulnerable to dynastic conflict, to the arrival of new settler groups, to the kind of commercial disruption that could follow a single bad monsoon season. But the broader civilization, the shared language, the shared faith, the shared commercial culture was resilient enough to absorb these shocks for 6 centuries. What it could not absorb was a cannon. When the Portuguese arrived on the Swahili coast in 1498, they entered a world they did not understand and did not try to understand. They saw wealth, and they saw an opportunity to take it. The century that followed of bombardment, occupation, extortion, and the systematic destruction of trading relationships built over 500 years is a later chapter in this story. But to understand what was destroyed, it is necessary to have understood what was there. The Swahili coast was not a collection of primitive trading posts. It was a fully formed commercial civilization, integrated into the largest economic system the pre-modern world had produced. The men who burned Kilwa in 1505 were not opening Africa to the world. They were cutting it off from a world it had always been part of. If you draw a line from the East African coast to the Strait of Malacca, the 2 anchors of the Indian Ocean world, it passes through India, not beside it, not near it, through it. India is not a participant in the Indian Ocean trade network. It is the network's anatomical center, the place where the western arc of the ocean meets the eastern, where the commodities of Africa and Arabia encounter the commodities of China and Southeast Asia, where the winds of both monsoon seasons converge on a single coastline. No trade of any significance moved across the medieval Indian Ocean without touching Indian hands, Indian ports, or Indian credit. The western coast of the Indian subcontinent, the Malabar coast, of what is now Kerala, was the world's primary source of black pepper. This single fact organized the economics of half the planet. Pepper was not a luxury in the medieval world. It was a necessity, a preservative, a flavoring agent, and a medicine, consumed in enormous quantities from Cairo to Canton, and available in its finest form only from the forests of the Western Ghats. Every merchant fleet that entered the Indian Ocean, from whatever direction, had pepper somewhere in its commercial calculations. And the pepper of the Malabar coast moved only through Calicut, the greatest port city on the western shore of India, governed by the Hindu ruler known as the Zamorin. The Zamorin of Calicut understood his position with exceptional clarity. He did not attempt to control the trade directly. He was not a merchant, and merchant republics worked differently from feudal states. Instead, he made Calicut the most commercially open port on the Malabar coast, deliberately attracting Arab and Persian merchants by offering them low duties, legal protection, and the right to operate by their own commercial customs. The Muslim merchant quarter in Calicut, the Koyakal, home to the Mapila trading community, was vast. Arab merchants had been settling there since at least the 7th century, marrying into local families, building mosques, and integrating into the fabric of the city so completely that by the medieval period, they were as much Keralite as they were Arab. The Zamorin protected them because their presence made Calicut wealthy. They stayed because Calicut gave them the conditions to work. What Calicut sold was not merely pepper, it was access to the entire agricultural production of the Western Ghats, carefully aggregated by a network of inland brokers who moved between the farming villages of the interior and the weighing houses of the coast. These brokers, many of them from the Nair and Mapila communities, were the invisible infrastructure of the spice trade. A ship captain arriving from Aden could not walk into the forests of Kerala and buy pepper from the farmers who grew it. He bought it through intermediaries who had already done the work of collection, quality assessment, and transport. The brokerage system was not an obstacle to trade. It was the mechanism that made trade at scale possible. North of Calicut, along the Gujarat coast, a different but equally important commercial world operated. Gujarat was the home of perhaps the most entrepreneurially aggressive merchant community in the medieval Indian Ocean, the Gujarati traders of the port city of Cambay, who by the 15th century had established themselves in virtually every major port from Aden to Malacca. The Portuguese chronicler, Tomé Pires, who surveyed the Indian Ocean world in the early 16th century, wrote of them with something close to awe. There were 1,000 Gujarati merchants in Malacca alone, he noted, besides 4,000 or 5,000 Gujarati sailors passing through. Cambay, he wrote, stretched out 2 arms, one toward Aden and one toward Malacca, as if the city were physically grasping the 2 ends of the Indian Ocean. The Gujarati merchants were not a single community. They included Muslim traders, Hindu Baniya merchants, and Jain commercial families groups that maintained separate religious identities but operated within overlapping commercial networks, often partnering across religious lines when the deal was profitable enough. What united them was a commercial culture of extraordinary sophistication, a facility with credit instruments, a talent for maintaining trust networks across long distances, and an appetite for risk that their more conservative Arab competitors sometimes found baffling. When the Portuguese arrived and tried to cut the Gujarati merchants out of the spice trade, they discovered how deeply those networks ran. The Gujaratis simply rerouted. It took the far more systematic violence of the Dutch East India Company to do what the Portuguese could not. India's role in the network was not only commercial, it was also nautical. Indian shipbuilders, particularly on the Malabar and Gujarat coasts, constructed some of the largest merchant vessels in the medieval Indian Ocean. The Great Nau, the Indian-built ocean-going ship that could carry several hundred tons of cargo, was a product of Indian timber and Indian craftsmanship. Teak from the forests of Kerala and Gujarat was the preferred material for Indian Ocean shipbuilding across the entire network. Arab and Omani shipbuilders imported it because no timber in Arabia could match its durability. Resistance to salt water. The wood of India was as much an export of the Indian Ocean trade as the pepper it carried. India also supplied the network with something less tangible but equally essential: intellectual and navigational knowledge. Indian astronomers had been charting the stars of the monsoon skies for millennia. Indian navigators had developed systems of stellar observation and coastal piloting that predated the Arabic navigational tradition and fed into it. The master navigator Ibn Majid, the Arab pilot who guided Vasco da Gama's fleet across the Arabian Sea in 1498, a fact that would haunt Arab commercial history for centuries, was working within a tradition of Indian Ocean navigation that was itself a synthesis of Arab, Indian, and Persian knowledge accumulated over 1,000 years of shared seafaring. The South Indian Chola dynasty, which dominated the Bay of Bengal from its base in the Tamil Nadu coast from the 9th to the 13th centuries, demonstrated what a state-backed Indian maritime power looked like when it decided the ocean was worth fighting for. In 1025 CE, the Chola Emperor Rajendra I launched a naval expedition across the Bay of Bengal and struck the ports of the Srivijaya Empire in Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula 14 ports. According to the inscriptions, captured or plundered in a single campaign. The raid was not a colonial project. It was a commercial intervention designed to break Srivijayan control of the Strait of Malacca and open the eastern end of the Indian Ocean to Chola and South Indian merchants. The Bay of Bengal, under Rajendra, was a Chola lake. The Chola interlude illustrates something fundamental about India's place in the network. India was the only participant in the Indian Ocean world that was large enough, wealthy enough, and commercially sophisticated enough to act as a system-level force rather than merely a node within someone else's system. The Arab merchants needed Indian pepper and Indian brokers. The Chinese needed Indian cotton and Indian intermediaries. The Swahili cities needed Indian cloth and Indian credit. Even the Portuguese, when they arrived to take the trade by force, found that they could not actually run the network without Indian intermediaries, and spent the next century trying to co-opt the very merchants they had come to dispossess. India's centrality was geographic, but it was also institutional. The diversity of Indian commercial communities, the fact that Hindu, Jain, and Muslim traders operated simultaneously in the same ports, competing but also cooperating, each with their own networks and their own specialist goods, gave the Indian commercial world a resilience that no single community mercantile system could match. If Arab merchants were excluded from a port, Gujarati Hindus could still operate. If the Mapila Muslims of Calicut were under pressure, the Nair brokers of the interior could still move pepper. The network had redundancy built into its Indian node, and that redundancy was one of the reasons it survived so much disruption for so long. Standing in Calicut's weighing hall in the 14th century, watching the pepper sacks arrive from the interior and the Arab dhows load their cargo for the return monsoon, you were standing at the center of the world's economy. The gold that bought that pepper had come from East Africa through Arab hands. The cotton cloth, used to pay the inland brokers, had come from Gujarat. The ship that would carry the pepper to Aden had been built from Malabar teak. The navigation chart in the captain's possession drew on Indian astronomy and Arab cartography. Every thread of the Indian Ocean network ran through this place. Calicut was not the world's most famous city. It was something more useful than famous. It was indispensable. The Arabian Peninsula sits at the junction of three seas. To the west, the Red Sea connects it to Egypt and the Mediterranean world. To the east, the Persian Gulf connects it to Persia, Mesopotamia, and the overland routes into Central Asia. To the south, the Arabian Sea opens onto the Indian Ocean and everything beyond. No other landmass on Earth sits at such a commercial crossroads. Arabia did not become the heart of the Indian Ocean trade network because of its own resources. The peninsula was largely desert, with limited agricultural output and no great rivers. It became central because of its position, and because the people who inhabited its coasts had understood that position earlier and more completely than anyone else. The great Arab merchant cities of the western Indian Ocean were not interior capitals of grand empires. They were port cities, lean, commercially specialized, and oriented entirely toward the sea. Aden, on the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula at the mouth of the Red Sea, was the western gateway of the entire Indian Ocean world. Every ship moving between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean passed through Aden's waters, and the city taxed that passage with impressive thoroughness. By the medieval period, Aden was one of the three greatest commercial cities in the Indian Ocean, ranked alongside Hormuz and Malacca as a place where the entire network converged. Its warehouses held the wealth of three continents. Aden's geography was almost absurdly advantageous. It sat inside the crater of an extinct volcano, which gave it a natural harbor of exceptional security. The winds that brought ships from India in the summer drove them onto the Red Sea. The winds that brought them back from Egypt and the Levant deposited them in Aden's lap. The city did not need to go looking for trade. Trade came to it, channeled there by physics. What the city's merchant families supplied was the infrastructure to handle that trade: warehouses, weighing stations, money changers, agents who could match a Gujarati cargo of cloth with a Venetian buyer seeking cotton, and a commercial court that settled disputes with a speed and authority that merchants from 4 continents learned to trust. Farther east, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, sat Hormuz, an island city of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary strangeness. The island itself produced almost nothing. It had no fresh water, no farmland, no timber. Everything Hormuz needed to sustain its population was imported by sea. What the island had was position. Hormuz controlled the entrance to the Persian Gulf, the corridor through which the trade of Mesopotamia and Persia flowed southward to join the Indian Ocean network. Any ship moving between the Gulf ports of Basra and the ocean beyond passed within range of Hormuz's authority. The island's rulers taxed that passage for centuries, and the revenues built a city of marble and commerce that astonished every visitor who described it. The medieval traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited Hormuz in the 14th century on his way to India, described a city where merchants from across the known world rubbed shoulders in the bazaars Persian, Arab, Indian, and East African traders, each speaking their own language but conducting their business in the shared commercial dialect of the Indian Ocean world. The city was so cosmopolitan, so thoroughly defined by its commercial function, that it had effectively no ethnic character of its own. Hormuz was a place that trade had created rather than a community that had happened to take up trade. It was a pure product of the network, and it lasted only as long as the network sustained it. When the Portuguese seized Hormuz in 1515, they did not conquer a city. They captured an economic mechanism. Between Aden and Hormuz, along the coast of Oman and the southern Arabian Peninsula, lay the heartland of Arab seafaring. The Omani coast, particularly the ports of Sohar and Sur, had been producing dhow builders and ocean navigators for more than 1,000 years before the medieval period. Sohar, in the early medieval centuries, was reputedly the largest city in the Islamic world east of Baghdad, a claim that reflects not its political importance but the extraordinary volume of trade that passed through its harbor. Omani sailors carried frankincense and dates southward to East Africa and eastward to India, returning with timber teak from the Malabar coast and mangrove poles from the African shore that the treeless Arabian Peninsula could not produce and urgently needed for construction. The Omani relationship with the sea was not merely commercial, it was cultural in the deepest sense. The practical knowledge of Indian Ocean navigation accumulated on the Omani coast over centuries and found its most sophisticated expression in the tradition of Arab nautical writing, of which Ibn Majid in the 15th century was the supreme representative. Ibn Majid's navigational manuals, written in verse, in a tradition that made them easier to memorize and transmit, described every port, every current, every wind pattern, and every seasonal departure window across the entire western Indian Ocean with a precision that Europeans would not match for another century. He was not a theorist. He was a working sea captain who had made the voyages himself, recording what he found and what worked, distilling the accumulated knowledge of generations of Omani and Arab mariners into texts that served as the operating manual of the ocean. The Persian merchants of the Gulf brought a different tradition to the network. Persia had been a commercial civilization long before Islam, and its merchants carried that heritage into the Muslim trading world with a sophistication in credit and long-distance finance that complemented the Arab facility with navigation and the Indian facility with brokerage. Persian merchants settled heavily on the Swahili coast. The Shirazi dynasty that founded the Kilwa Sultanate claimed Persian ancestry, whether accurately or as a mark of commercial prestige, and along the Indian coast, where Persian-speaking traders integrated into the Gujarati commercial world so thoroughly that their descendants still form a distinct mercantile community. The Parsi merchants of western India, whose ancestors fled the Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th century and settled in Gujarat, became over the following centuries some of the most commercially sophisticated members of the entire Indian Ocean network. What Arabia and the Persian Gulf provided to the network was not, in the end, primarily goods. The peninsula exported frankincense, dates, horses, copper from Oman, and pearls from the Gulf, important commodities, but not the foundational ones. What Arabia exported was people, merchants, navigators, financiers, and legal scholars who spread across the Indian Ocean world carrying the institutional infrastructure of Islamic commerce. Everywhere an Arab merchant settled, he built a mosque and, with the mosque, a framework of commercial law. Everywhere he established a partnership, he inserted the Qurad contract into local commercial practice. Arabia's great export to the Indian Ocean world was, in the broadest sense, the operating system itself. The Red Sea corridor, running north from Aden to the Egyptian port of Aden and onward to Cairo, was the channel through which Indian Ocean wealth flowed into the Mediterranean economy. Cairo under the Fatimid Caliphate and then under the Ayyubids and Mamluks surpassed Baghdad as the commercial hub of the Western Islamic world from the 11th century onward, precisely because Cairo sat at the northern terminus of the Red Sea route. Egyptian merchants moved pepper, spices, and textiles from Aden northward through the Red Sea, through the port of Qusair or overland from the Gulf of Suez, and into the Mediterranean markets where Italian merchants, Venetians, Genoese, Pisans, bought them for onward sale to Europe. Medieval Europe's economy ran, in significant part, on goods that had passed through Arab hands in Aden and Egyptian hands in Cairo. The Italian merchants who grew rich on this trade are remembered. The Arab and Egyptian intermediaries who made the trade possible have been largely forgotten. Between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, there is a gap. It is not wide at its narrowest point. The Strait of Malacca is barely 2.5 miles across. But through that gap passed, for 7 centuries, the most valuable maritime commerce on Earth. Every ship moving between the spice islands of the Indonesian archipelago and the markets of India, Arabia, and China had to thread itself through this channel. Whoever controlled the strait controlled the eastern half of the Indian Ocean trade network. The political history of Southeast Asia, in large part, is the story of who held that position and what they did with it. The first great power to understand the strait's potential was Srivijaya, a maritime empire that emerged from Palembang on the eastern coast of Sumatra in the late 7th century CE. Srivijaya's genius was not military, though it had a capable navy. It was commercial and diplomatic. Rather than simply taxing ships, Srivijaya made itself indispensable to them, providing safe anchorage, reliable supplies of provisions, skilled pilots who knew the local waters, and protection from the pirates who infested the narrow passages. A merchant who stopped at a Srivijayan port paid duties but received services. The arrangement was, for most purposes, mutually beneficial, and it worked well enough that Srivijaya dominated the Strait of Malacca for the better part of 4 centuries. The goods that flowed through Srivijayan ports were staggering in variety. Sumatra itself produced camphor, benzoin resin, gold, and pepper. Java contributed rice, cotton cloth, and indigo. The spice islands of Maluku, the Banda Islands, Ternate, Tidore, produced cloves and nutmeg that existed nowhere else on Earth in commercially viable quantities. These were not mere flavorings. Cloves were a preservative and medicine. used throughout the Islamic world, and increasingly in China. Nutmeg was used in pharmacology and cuisine from Cairo to Canton. Their scarcity and uniqueness gave them a value entirely disproportionate to their weight or volume, and all of it moved through Srivijayan waters. Srivijaya also became a center of Buddhist scholarship that reinforced its commercial position in a way that is easy to underestimate. Buddhist pilgrims traveling between China and the great monasteries of India stopped at Srivijayan ports to study with resident teachers. Chinese pilgrims in the 7th century CE noted that thousands of monks lived in the Srivijayan capital, and that the city was a place of learning worth spending years in. This made Srivijaya a cultural junction as well as a commercial one, a place where Chinese, Indian, Malay, and Arab cultural currents intersected, reinforcing one another and producing a cosmopolitan urban civilization of considerable sophistication. The Chola naval expedition of 1025 CE Rajendra Chola's strike across the Bay of Bengal against Srivijayan ports disrupted Srivijaya's dominance without replacing it with any stable alternative. The empire fragmented over the following centuries, weakened by the Chola raids, and then by shifts in the trade routes themselves, as Muslim and Chinese merchants began to bypass the older Srivijayan entrepots in favor of smaller, more accommodating ports. What replaced Srivijaya was not a single successor but a constellation of smaller polities, each competing for a share of the Strait's commerce. The pattern of the Indian Ocean network, distributed, resilient, impossible to fully monopolize, reproduced itself in miniature along the Strait of Malacca. Out of this fragmented world, one polity rose to a dominance that surpassed even Srivijaya's. Malacca was founded around 1400 CE by Parameswara, a Malay prince who had fled the collapse of his own small kingdom on the island of Singapore. He chose his new site carefully, a natural harbor on the western coast of the Malay Peninsula, positioned directly on the strait's main shipping lane, with easy access to fresh water and provisions. Within a generation, Malacca had become the most important trading port in Southeast Asia. Within 2 generations, it was one of the most important commercial cities in the world. The key to Malacca's success was a deliberate policy of commercial openness combined with institutional sophistication. Parameswara and his successors converted to Islam, which gave them immediate access to the Arab and Gujarati merchant networks that dominated the western Indian Ocean. They organized the city around 4 harbor masters, one for merchants from the west, one for those from Java and the eastern islands, one for Chinese traders, and one for all others, each responsible for managing the trading community from his region and resolving disputes according to that community's own customs. A merchant arriving in Malacca did not have to navigate a foreign legal system. He operated within a framework designed to make him feel at home, and the Malaccan state collected its revenues in port duties rather than in arbitrary exactions. Trust built trade, and trade built the city. At Malacca's height in the 15th century, the Malay chronicler Tomé Pires, who was Portuguese but had spent years in the city, estimated that 84 languages were spoken in its streets and bazaars. This was not mere hyperbole. Merchants arrived from Gujarat, from the Coromandel coast of South India, from Arabia, from Persia, from Java, from Borneo, from the Moluccas, from China, and from dozens of smaller trading communities scattered across the archipelago. Malay became the common commercial language of the Eastern Indian Ocean, the means by which merchants from mutually incomprehensible linguistic traditions conducted business. The city was, in the fullest sense, a world in miniature, and the world it miniaturized was the Indian Ocean. Islam spread through Southeast Asia along the same sea lanes that carried pepper and porcelain. It did not arrive by conquest. It arrived in the persons of Muslim merchants who settled in port cities and offered the local elite the same practical advantage it had offered everywhere else: integration into the legal, financial, and social infrastructure of the Islamic commercial world. Rulers who converted gained access to Gujarati credit networks, to Arab legal traditions, to the dinar-denominated economy of the Western Ocean. By the 15th century, the entire arc of the Malay Peninsula and the western Indonesian archipelago had become Muslim, not through armies, but through the accumulated commercial logic of 7 centuries of Islamic merchant settlement. The faith followed the money, and the money followed the wind. The Spice Islands, at the eastern end of the network, the Moluccas, particularly the tiny Banda Islands, occupied a position in the medieval world that is almost impossible to convey in modern terms. Cloves grew only on 5 small islands in the northern Moluccas. Nutmeg and mace grew only on the even smaller Banda Islands, a cluster of 10 islets in the Banda Sea. No amount of effort or capital could establish these crops elsewhere. The specific ecology of these places was unrepeatable. This absolute biological monopoly gave the islands a commercial importance entirely out of proportion to their size or population, and it made control of the trade routes connecting them to the rest of the world among the most fiercely contested commercial prizes in history. It was, in the end, the desire to break into this trade that brought the Portuguese east of Goa, that brought the Dutch into the Indian Ocean, and that produced some of the most sustained commercial violence the early modern world had yet seen. Malacca's fall to the Portuguese in 1511 was the eastern pivot point of the network's destruction. Afonso de Albuquerque took the city after a brief siege, expelled its Muslim merchant communities, and attempted to redirect the spice trade through Portuguese-controlled channels. He failed, fundamentally, because the network was more resilient than any single city within it. The Muslim merchants of Malacca dispersed to Aceh, Johor, Brunei, and a dozen smaller ports, carrying their commercial relationships with them. The trade rerouted. New entrepots rose. The Portuguese held the ruins of a city but not the system it had served, and the system modified, disrupted, but not destroyed, continued to function for another century before the Dutch arrived with the resources and ruthlessness to complete what Portugal had started. Southeast Asia's role in the Indian Ocean network was to be the source of the most irreplaceable commodities in the system and the custodian of the bottleneck through which they all had to pass. The Strait was geography. The spices were biology. Neither could be replicated or moved. Every power that entered the Indian Ocean world had to come to terms with those two facts. And every power that tried to simply seize them rather than integrate into the commercial civilization that had grown up around them eventually found that a strait policed by cannons still could not produce cloves from a pram. Geography that did not grow them or replace the trust networks of 4 centuries with a fort and a garrison. China was the largest economy in the medieval world. By the time the Song dynasty reached its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries, China produced more manufactured goods, sustained more urban population, and generated more surplus wealth than any other civilization on Earth. Its silk workshops, its porcelain kilns, its iron foundries, its paper mills, these were not artisanal operations. They were industrial, in the sense that matters, producing at volumes and to standards that no other society could match. The Indian Ocean trade network needed China's output to function. China, in turn, needed the Indian Ocean's raw materials, the spices, the ivory, the aromatic woods, the tropical products that Chinese markets consumed in enormous quantities. The relationship was one of mutual dependence, but it was a dependence that China's rulers were perpetually ambivalent about acknowledging. The port of Quanzhou, on the southeastern coast of Fujian province, was China's primary window onto the Indian Ocean world during the Song and Yuan dynasties. By the 13th century, Quanzhou, which Arab and Persian merchants called Zaytun, had a population that one source estimated at 500,000, with a substantial Arab quarter on its waterfront where mosques, caravanserais, and commercial courts served a Muslim merchant community that had been resident there for generations. Marco Polo, passing through in the late 13th century, described Quanzhou's harbor as frequented by all the ships of India, a claim that was not metaphor but observation. The harbor was one of the busiest in the world, and what moved through it flowed in both directions. What China exported was, above all, ceramics. Song dynasty porcelain was the consumer good of the medieval Indian Ocean, desired everywhere, produced at quality and scale only in China, and durable enough to survive the long sea voyages that distributed it across half the planet. Shards of Song and Yuan porcelain have been found along the entire East African coast, at archaeological sites from Mogadishu to the Zimbabwean plateau. Swahili city-state elites used Chinese porcelain not merely as tableware but as markers of status and cosmopolitan connection, embedding pieces in the walls of their mosques and palaces as visible evidence of their integration into the world's most sophisticated commercial system. A celadon bowl from Long Quan displayed in a Kilwa mosque was not decoration, it was a credential. China also exported silk, but silk, unlike ceramics, had competitors. Indian cotton cloth, Persian brocades, and various Southeast Asian textiles all competed for Indian Ocean markets. Ceramics had no real competition. The specific chemical and thermal conditions required to produce true porcelain hard, translucent, resonant, were understood only by Chinese craftsmen working with Chinese clays fired in Chinese kilns. Attempts to replicate the product in the Islamic world produced beautiful results, but not the same thing. The Longquan celadon, the blue and white wares of Zheng, the white porcelain of the Ding kilns, these were unique industrial products that the network could not generate from any other source. And the kilns of Fujian and Zhejiang structured their entire output around the export market's demands. Chinese demand for Indian Ocean goods was equally structural. Pepper from the Malabar coast reached Chinese markets in quantities that made it a bulk commodity rather than a luxury, a staple of Chinese cuisine and medicine that required constant replenishment. Frankincense and other aromatics from Arabia were burned in Chinese temples and used in Chinese pharmacology. Ivory from East Africa was carved into Chinese luxury objects. Tropical hardwoods from Southeast Asia were used in Chinese furniture and construction. The network that supplied China with these goods was, from China's perspective, an import system, but one so deeply embedded in Chinese consumption patterns that disrupting it would have been felt across the entire economy. The Chinese state's relationship to this commerce was characteristically complicated. The Confucian imperial tradition viewed merchants with suspicion. Trade was considered a lower status activity than agriculture, scholarship, or military service. And merchants occupied a structurally ambiguous position in the imperial hierarchy. The Song and Yuan governments taxed maritime trade heavily and periodically imposed restrictions on it. Yet, those same governments also actively promoted overseas trade when it suited them, sending diplomatic missions to Southeast Asian states to encourage merchants to come to China. Establishing the Maritime Trade Superintendency at Quanzhou in 1087 to regulate and tax the traffic, and in the Song period for the first time collecting more revenue from maritime commerce than from the overland Silk Road. The state's ambivalence about trade did not prevent it from depending on trade's revenues. The Fujianese merchant communities of the southern Chinese coast developed in the interstices of official ambivalence, one of the most entrepreneurially vigorous commercial cultures in the medieval world. The Hokkien merchants of Quanzhou and Zhangzhou, operating within an institutional framework that officially disapproved of them but practically relied on them, built trade networks across Southeast Asia that would persist in altered form into the modern era. By the 15th century, Chinese merchant communities had established themselves in ports across the Malay archipelago, in Java, in Champa, in the ports of the Gulf of Thailand. They married local women, built temples to Mazu, the sea goddess, and created the hybrid communities Peranakan Chinese, Chinese Malay, Sino-Javanese, whose descendants form significant portions of the populations of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines to this day. The Chinese junk, the great multi-masted vessel of the South China Sea, with its watertight compartmentalized hull and its distinctive battened sails, was a different animal from the Arab dhow. Where the dhow was flexible and built for the open Indian Ocean, the junk was massive and built for heavy cargo. The largest ocean-going junks of the Song and Yuan periods were among the biggest wooden vessels anywhere in the medieval world, capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo and dozens of passengers in relative comfort. Arab travelers who encountered them were consistently astonished. Ibn Battuta, who sailed on Chinese junks between India and China in the 14th century, described vessels with separate cabins for merchants, with gardens growing on the decks. With bathing facilities and elaborate cooking arrangements, these were not ships that treated ocean crossing as an ordeal. They were designed for a regular, institutionalized commerce that assumed the voyage would be made again and again. The Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Empire that ruled China from 1271 to 1368, initially disrupted Chinese maritime trade through the chaos of conquest, but then proved, in its mature phase, one of the great enablers of Indian Ocean commerce. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative stability across the Eurasian landmass under Mongol suzerainty, opened overland trade routes that had been blocked by political fragmentation, and the Mongol rulers of China actively promoted maritime trade as a source of revenue. Quanzhou under the Yuan became a genuinely cosmopolitan city. Its governor for a period was a Muslim merchant from Quanzhou's Arab community, reflecting the degree to which the state had come to depend on the commercial expertise of its foreign merchant residents. The 14th century was the Indian Ocean network's most expansive period, and Chinese demand and Chinese production were central to that expansion. China's position at the edge of the network, geographically the most distant major participant, commercially the most indispensable consumer and producer, gave the system a structural characteristic that would prove fateful. Because China was so large and so economically self-sufficient, its decisions about maritime engagement had system-level consequences. When China participated actively, as it did under the Song, Yuan, and early Ming, the network expanded in volume and sophistication. When China withdrew, as it would, dramatically, in the mid-15th century, the network lost its largest market and its most productive manufacturer simultaneously. The Indian Ocean world was resilient enough to survive Portuguese cannon. It was not quite resilient enough to survive both Portuguese cannon and Chinese withdrawal at the same time. The Indian Ocean Trade Network had no headquarters, no governing council, no central bank, no Supreme Court, no single currency that every participant was required to use, no navy that enforced the rules. There was no founding treaty, no membership register, no system of fines for breach of commercial norms. What it had instead was something more durable and more sophisticated than any of those things: a set of shared practices, shared institutions, and shared moral commitments that allowed strangers to trust each other across vast distances in transactions that could take years to complete, in a world where the legal enforcement mechanisms available to wronged parties were, by any modern standard, extremely limited. Understanding how that trust was built and maintained is not a footnote to the history of the Indian Ocean, it is the history. The basic unit of Indian Ocean commerce was the partnership. A merchant did not typically send a ship to Calicut loaded with goods he owned outright, hoping to sell them at a profit and return home. The risk was too great, the capital requirements too high, the knowledge required about distant markets too specialist for any individual to master alone. Instead, long-distance trade was structured through layered partnerships that distributed risk, expertise, and capital across multiple parties. An investor in Cairo might entrust gold to a ship captain in Aden through the Kirad contract. That captain might carry goods for a further set of investors in addition to his own cargo. The goods might be sold in Calicut through a local broker who took a percentage and guaranteed the quality of what he sold, and the profits, when they arrived back in Cairo months or years later, would be distributed according to the terms of contracts that had been drawn up in Arabic legal form before the ship ever left port. The system worked because the participants could be held accountable not by courts in the modern sense, but by reputation networks that were, in their own way, more effective. A merchant who cheated a partner in Aden could not simply move to a new city and start again. The merchant communities of the Indian Ocean were small enough and interconnected enough that news of a betrayal spread rapidly, through letters, through the testimony of ship captains who moved between ports, through the reports of agents who managed commercial relationships on behalf of absent principals. To be known as untrustworthy in the Indian Ocean merchant world was a commercial death sentence. The punishment for dishonesty was exclusion, and exclusion meant ruin. The most remarkable documentary evidence of how this trust system functioned in practice survived not in a commercial archive, but in a synagogue storeroom in Cairo. The Cairo Geniza, a cache of documents preserved in the Ben Ezra Synagogue, including the commercial correspondence of Jewish merchants active in the 11th and 12th centuries, contains letters that reveal the internal mechanics of Indian Ocean trade in extraordinary detail. A merchant in Aden writes to his partner in Fustat Old Cairo about a shipment of pepper that has arrived from the Malabar coast, about the prices being offered, about the honesty of a broker whose judgment he trusts, about a rival merchant who has been trying to undercut their prices. The letters are businesslike, precise, and occasionally furious when a partner has made a decision without consultation. They are recognizably modern. They document a commercial culture that solved the problems of long-distance trust without bureaucracy, without surveillance, and without state enforcement. Alongside reputation, the network ran on information, market intelligence, the prices of pepper in Aden, the quantities of cotton cloth available in Gujarat, the political situation in Calicut that was making the Zamarin more or less accommodating to foreign merchants was worth money, and its flow through the network was as important as the flow of goods. Merchant letters served this function explicitly. They were simultaneously personal correspondence, commercial instructions to agents, and intelligence bulletins about conditions across the network. A Gujarati merchant in Malacca, writing to his family firm in Cambay, was simultaneously reporting market conditions, instructing on how to respond to them, and maintaining the personal relationship that made the whole enterprise possible. The letter was an instrument of commerce. Credit instruments allowed the network to function without the constant physical movement of precious metals. The hundi, the Indian credit instrument, and the Arabic suftaja, a kind of bill of exchange, allowed merchants to transfer value across long distances without shipping gold or silver. A merchant who sold pepper in Aden could receive a document entitling his representative in Cairo to collect the equivalent value from a correspondent merchant there. The debt was honored through the same reputation networks that enforced other commercial norms. A merchant house that failed to honor a suftaja became, by that failure, a merchant house that no one would do business with. The instruments were backed by character, not by law, and they worked. The broker was the node through which most transactions flowed. In every major port city, a class of professional intermediaries existed whose function was to mediate between visiting merchants and local markets, to assess the quality of goods, to find buyers, to negotiate prices, and to provide the local knowledge and relationships that an itinerant trader, arriving with the monsoon and departing with its reversal, could not possibly accumulate himself. These brokers, Banyan merchants in Gujarat, Mapila traders on the Malabar coast, Swahili intermediaries on the East African shore, were not mere middlemen. They were the carriers of the knowledge infrastructure that made the network's complexity manageable. They spoke the languages of both the ship captain and the inland farmer, and their cut of each transaction was the price the network paid for its own efficiency. The diaspora community was the institutional structure that made all of this work across cultural and linguistic boundaries. When a Gujarati merchant settled in Malacca or a Yemeni trader established himself in Calicut, he did not operate in isolation. He joined or created a community of merchants from his own background, organized around a mosque or a temple, a shared language, a shared legal tradition, and a web of kinship and commercial relationships that connected him back to his home port and outward to every other node in the network where members of his community had settled. These diaspora communities maintained a dual loyalty to the host city where they lived and paid taxes, and to the commercial network that gave them their livelihood, and the tension between those loyalties was, in most cases, productively managed by the fact that both the host city and the diaspora community needed each other. The Armenian merchants, the Jewish traders of the Geniza world, the Gujarati Baniyas, the Fujianese Hokkien communities, the Arab and Persian merchant families of the Swahili coast, all of these operated through the same basic mechanism. Ethnic and religious solidarity reduced the information costs of long-distance trade. A Gujarati merchant arriving in a new port could, through his diaspora community, immediately access a network of established relationships, tested agents, and shared knowledge that would have taken years to build from scratch. He paid for this access through the obligations of community membership, through loans to community members in difficulty, through the sharing of commercial intelligence, through the enforcement of norms against cheating on other community members. The community was an insurance scheme, an intelligence service, and a commercial court rolled into one. The network also had a seasonal rhythm that was itself a form of governance. The monsoon imposed a structure on commercial life that no human institution could have replicated. Goods had to be bought, loaded, and shipped within defined windows. Prices fluctuated predictably around the arrival and departure of the seasonal fleets. Credit terms were calibrated to the duration of a monsoon voyage. The Malabar pepper harvest was timed to the southwest monsoon's peak. The Swahili city-state's commercial calendar revolved around the arrival of the Arab dhows in January and their departure in April. Merchants who missed the wind waited, and in waiting, deepened their integration into the host community. The monsoon did not merely enable trade, it organized it. The absence of a central authority was, paradoxically, one of the system's greatest strengths, because no single power could control the network. No single political catastrophe could destroy it. The collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258 disrupted Baghdad, but did not break the trade. The routes shifted, the merchants adapted, and Cairo absorbed the commercial functions that Baghdad could no longer perform. The fragmentation of the Srivijayan Empire disrupted the Strait of Malacca, but did not stop the spice trade. New entrepots rose to replace the old ones, and the goods found new channels. The network was not a structure, it was a behavior, a set of practices and relationships that reproduced themselves wherever the conditions of maritime commerce and shared institutional norms were met. You could burn a city, you could not burn a behavior. What the network could not survive was a power that was not interested in participating in its norms, a power that arrived not to trade within the system, but to seize the system's revenues by force, backed by military technology that the system had no mechanism to resist. The Indian Ocean merchant world had no army because it had never needed one. Its enemies, historically, had been pirates, individual actors who could be managed, bribed, or suppressed by the port authorities of the cities they threatened. The Portuguese were not pirates. They were a state with a fleet of warships, a strategic plan, and a theological conviction that the seizure of Muslim trade was a righteous act. The system that had governed itself through trust and reputation for 7 centuries had no answer to that. But that answer's absence, and what it cost, is not the whole story. The network survived Portuguese violence for more than a century, adapting, rerouting, and finding ways to continue despite the Cartaz system and the guns. It took the Dutch East India Company, better capitalized, more systematic, and willing to use a level of organized violence that the Portuguese had only approximated, to finally break what the monsoon had built. And even then, the breaking was incomplete. The descendants of those merchant communities still trade. The Swahili language still speaks Arabic. Indonesia is still Muslim. The network left marks on the world that 7 centuries of violence have not been able to erase. What the Indian Ocean world had created in 7 centuries of stateless self-organization was not merely a commercial system. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that large-scale, sophisticated, multicultural economic exchange was possible without conquest, without coercion, and without a sovereign authority standing behind every contract with a sword. The world was shown this once, and then shown what happens to such systems when sovereigns with swords arrive to claim the credit. When historians describe the Indian Ocean trade network as a commercial system, the word commercial is doing less work than it should. A commercial system moves goods. What the Indian Ocean moved was civilization not as a metaphor for economic activity, but as a literal description of what traveled on those ships and in those merchant communities across 7 centuries of ocean crossing. The network was a transmission mechanism for everything that made the medieval world more sophisticated than it would otherwise have been. The tools of navigation, the instruments of agriculture, the methods of finance, the texts of philosophy, the practices of religion, and the biological raw materials of food systems that still shape how half the world eats today. The goods themselves, before anything else. The list of what moved through the Indian Ocean trade network reads like an inventory of everything that the medieval world considered worth having. Pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger, the spices of the Malabar coast and the Indonesian archipelago, moved westward in quantities that sustained the dietary and medical practices of the entire Islamic world and much of China. Cotton cloth from Gujarat and the Coromandel coast of South India moved in both directions westward to East Africa and Arabia, eastward to Southeast Asia, and the scale of the Indian textile industry that served this trade was, by any measure, one of the great manufacturing operations of the pre-industrial world. Chinese porcelain moved westward, East African gold moved eastward, Arabian frankincense moved in multiple directions simultaneously. Persian horses, the finest cavalry mounts available in the medieval world, moved from Arabia to India, where the Vijayanagara kingdom and the Deccan sultanates paid enormous prices for them. The network traded everything, across a geography that covered half the planet. Technology was among the most consequential cargo, and unlike pepper, it left no weight in a ship's hold. The magnetic compass, developed in China and used by Chinese navigators from at least the 11th century, reached the Arab navigational world through the trade networks and fundamentally transformed the safety and reliability of long-distance ocean sailing. Before the compass, navigators in the open ocean relied on stellar observation, which was impossible in cloudy weather and unreliable near the horizon. The compass gave sailors a fixed directional reference regardless of visibility. It spread westward through the Indian Ocean world and eventually into the Mediterranean, and, through the Mediterranean, into the hands of Portuguese navigators planning the voyages that would disrupt the very network that had transmitted it, was one of the more remarkable ironic loops in the history of technology. The astrolabe, an instrument for measuring the altitude of celestial bodies and thereby determining latitude, was refined and systematized by Arab astronomers and navigators in the 9th and 10th centuries, drawing on earlier Greek and Indian astronomical traditions. In its maritime form, it gave sailors the ability to determine their position with a precision that stellar observation alone could not provide. And its spread through the Indian Ocean navigational community made the longer, more ambitious voyages of the high medieval period possible. Ibn Majid's navigational manuals, which described stellar positions and seasonal wind patterns across the entire western Indian Ocean with extraordinary precision, were the intellectual product of a tradition that had been accumulating and sharing astronomical and navigational knowledge across the network for centuries. The Portuguese navigators who used those manuals after their conquest of the ocean that had produced them were, in this sense, sailing on Arab science. The latent sail, the triangular rig that allowed a vessel to sail across or even partially into the wind, rather than only with it directly behind, spread through the Indian Ocean world and eventually into the Mediterranean in ways that fundamentally altered what ships could do and where they could go. A square-rigged vessel was a creature of following winds. A latent-rigged vessel could work across the wind, making voyages possible that would otherwise have required waiting for a wind shift that might not come for months. The dhow's latent rig was the product of centuries of iterative refinement in the specific conditions of the Indian Ocean monsoon system, and its eventual adoption in the Mediterranean, where it appears on the caravels that made the European age of exploration possible, was one of the more direct transmissions from the Indian Ocean civilization to the European. The stern post rudder, a fixed rudder mounted on the centerline of the ship's stern, replacing the less controllable steering oars used by earlier vessels, spread through the Indian Ocean world and then westward into European shipbuilding, where it enabled the construction of vessels large enough and maneuverable enough to cross the Atlantic. The transfer was not instantaneous or deliberate. It happened through the accumulation of contact between shipbuilding traditions, through Arab and Gujarati ships being observed by Mediterranean traders, through the gradual adoption of superior techniques by craftsmen who recognized their value. Technology in the pre-modern world moved the same way goods did through networks of contact, observation, and adaptation, without patents or borders to slow it. Agricultural products moved through the network in ways that permanently transformed the food systems of entire regions. The banana, which originated in Southeast Asia, reached East Africa through the Austronesian maritime world and became a staple crop across the continent. Rice, a Southeast Asian and South Asian staple, spread westward along the Indian Ocean routes and established itself as a primary food crop in East Africa, the Persian Gulf, and eventually the Mediterranean world. Coconut palms spread westward from their Southeast Asian origins across the entire Indian Ocean littoral, providing food, oil, fiber, and the raw material for dao construction simultaneously. Citrus fruits, lemons, limes, oranges, moved from South and Southeast Asia westward through Arab intermediaries and eventually into the Mediterranean, where they became so thoroughly integrated into the cuisine and agriculture of the region that their foreign origin was entirely forgotten. Sugarcane, originally domesticated in New Guinea and cultivated in South and Southeast Asia, moved westward through the network and established itself in Persia and the Arab world before the medieval Islamic expansion carried it into North Africa and eventually into Europe and the Atlantic islands. The sugar industry that would drive the Atlantic slave trade, the industry that made Barbados and Jamaica and Brazil into plantation economies of extraordinary violence, was built on a crop whose westward journey began on Arab dhows crossing the Indian Ocean 1,000 years before Columbus. The consequences of what moved on the network extended far beyond the network itself. Ideas moved most freely of all because they required no hold space and paid no port duties. The mathematical tradition that Europe calls Arabic numerals the positional decimal system with zero that makes modern mathematics possible originated in India, was adopted and refined by Islamic scholars and moved westward through the Arab commercial network into the Mediterranean world, where it reached Europe through the Italian merchants who traded with the Islamic world. The zero, the decimal place, the algebraic notation that makes engineering and science possible, all of these are products of the Indian Ocean civilization's intellectual transmission network. And the debt that the modern world owes to that transmission is incalculable. Islam itself was the most consequential idea the network transmitted. It spread not by the sword in this context, but by the merchant settlement by settlement, conversion by conversion. As Muslim traders established communities in port cities across the Indian Ocean world, and the practical advantages of joining the Islamic commercial framework made conversion an attractive option for local elites. Indonesia, today the world's largest Muslim-majority country, became Muslim. Through this process, through the accumulated effect of Arab and Gujarati merchant settlement in Sumatran and Javan port cities between the 13th and 15th centuries, and through the subsequent conversion of inland populations as the coastal Islamic communities extended their cultural influence, there was no Islamic conquest of Indonesia. There was a gradual, commercially driven permeation of Islamic practice and identity that took 2 centuries and left the world's 4th most populous country permanently transformed. The Swahili language is a monument to the network's capacity for cultural synthesis. Its grammatical structure is Bantu, the product of the Bantu farming communities that occupied the East African coast before the Arab merchants arrived. Its vocabulary is saturated with Arabic, not just religious and legal terms, but the words for counting, measuring, sailing, trading, and administering. Kiswahili is what happens when 2 civilizations meet on a shoreline over 500 years and conduct their business together, a language that is both things simultaneously, belonging fully to neither but capable of expressing everything that both required. It became the lingua franca of East Africa, not because any authority imposed it, but because it worked, because it was the language in which the commerce of the coast was conducted, and commerce was what the coast was for. What moved through the Indian Ocean trade network, in the end, was the medieval world's best version of itself. Its most sophisticated financial instruments, its most advanced navigational knowledge, its most ambitious agricultural experiments, its most expansive religious traditions, its most cosmopolitan cultural syntheses. The network was not merely a system for moving pepper from Kerala to Cairo. It was the primary mechanism by which the medieval world became more sophisticated, more connected, and more capable than it would otherwise have been. And the civilization that dismantled it, that arrived with cannons and Cartaz passes, and the conviction that trade was something to be seized rather than participated in, inherited the benefits of what it had destroyed, while ensuring that its destroyers would be remembered as its discoverers. In July 1405, a fleet unlike anything the Indian Ocean had ever seen assembled at the mouth of the Yangtze River and prepared to sail. The fleet comprised more than 300 ships. At its core were the treasure ships, the Baoshuan multi-masted vessels of extraordinary size, their red silk sails filled with the southeast monsoon, carrying silk, porcelain, and the authority of the Yongle Emperor of the Ming dynasty. The man who commanded them was Zheng, a Chinese Muslim eunuch from Yunnan province, a former prisoner of war who had risen to become the most trusted naval commander in China's history. He would spend the next 28 years of his life on the water, making 7 voyages that reached East Africa and the Red Sea. And his fleet, the largest and most powerful naval armada the pre-modern world had yet assembled, sailed through waters that no Chinese state vessel had ever formally claimed. The scale of what Zheng commanded is worth dwelling on. The first voyage carried nearly 28,000 men. The treasure ships themselves were, by any comparative measure, the largest wooden vessels afloat in the world at that moment. And that world, in 1405, included every navy from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. Scholars continue to debate the exact dimensions, but the most conservative estimates place the largest treasure ships at over 200 feet in length vessels that dwarfed any European ship of the same era. When Vasco da Gama anchored off Calicut in 1498, with 4 small ships and a crew of fewer than 200, the Indian Ocean he sailed into had already been visited, more than half a century earlier, by a Chinese fleet that was, by the most restrained calculation, roughly 100 times larger. Zheng did not come as a conqueror. The voyages were diplomatic and commercial in orientation, designed to extend the Ming tributary system, to establish China's presence as the preeminent power of the Indian Ocean world, and to bring back the exotic goods and diplomatic acknowledgments that the Yongle Emperor required to assert the legitimacy and grandeur of his reign. At the ports where the fleet arrived, Zheng presented lavish gifts and received tribute in return, ambassadors, animals, and the formal acknowledgement that the distant rulers of Arabia, India, and East Africa recognized the Ming Emperor's supremacy. A giraffe from Malindi, presented to the emperor as a mythical qilin, a beast of good omen, caused a sensation at the court in Nanjing. The voyages were, in this sense, a sustained act of imperial theater conducted on a planetary stage. But they were also something more than theater. The fleet's presence along the East African coast, where Chinese goods had been moving for centuries through Arab and Indian intermediaries, was the direct assertion of a Chinese state interest in an ocean that Chinese private merchants had long been navigating without official sanction. Zheng voyages suppressed piracy along the key trade routes, intervened in political disputes in Sri Lanka and Sumatra to install rulers more favorable to Chinese interests, and established a pattern of Chinese state engagement with the Indian Ocean world that, had it continued, would have transformed the geopolitics of the 15th century beyond recognition. The fourth voyage, departing in 1413, went further than any previous Chinese naval expedition past India, past Arabia, into the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and then along the East African coast to Malindi and Mogadishu. Cities that had been trading with Chinese merchants for generations suddenly received Chinese state vessels flying the imperial banner. The sultans of Malindi and Mogadishu sent ambassadors back to Nanjing. The Indian Ocean, in those years, had a new potential hegemon, one with infinitely greater resources, infinitely greater naval capacity, and infinitely less appetite for violence than the power that would arrive from the other direction 60 years later. The Yongle Emperor died in 1424. His successor, the Hongxi Emperor, immediately suspended the voyages. One final voyage was authorized under the Swan Emperor in 1431, and Zheng died at sea, or shortly after returning from it in 1433. With him, died the state's interest in the ocean. The treasure shipyard at Nanjing, where the great fleet had been built, was shut down and allowed to decay. The nautical charts and records of the voyages were, in later decades, systematically destroyed by Confucian officials who viewed the expeditions as wasteful extravagance, a monument to eunuch overreach, and a distraction from the empire's proper concern with the defense of its northern frontiers against the Mongols. The reasons for the withdrawal are still debated. Fiscal pressure was real, the voyages were expensive, and the Mongol threat on the northern frontier was consuming resources. The power struggle between the Confucian scholar official class and the eunuchs who had championed the voyages was equally real, and with Zheng dead and the Yongle Emperor gone, the Confucians won. Their position was ideological as well as political. The proper order of the Chinese world placed agriculture above commerce, the empire's interior above its coasts, and the regulation of foreign relations through the tributary system above the messy entanglements of maritime trade. The ocean, in this worldview, was not an opportunity. It was a distraction. The counterfactual is irresistible and unanswerable. What would have happened if the voyages had continued? If, instead of burning the charts and closing the shipyard, the Ming had maintained their fleet's presence in the Indian Ocean through the second half of the 15th century. If the Portuguese caravels that rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and 1497 had found, waiting for them in the Indian Ocean, not a stateless merchant world, with no navy, but the successors of the greatest fleet the pre-modern world had ever assembled, the question answers itself. The Indian Ocean world's defenselessness, in the face of Portuguese violence, was not inevitable. It was the consequence of a decision made in a court in Nanjing, decades before da Gama left Lisbon. The irony runs deeper still. China had the compass that da Gama's navigators used. China had the largest ships in the ocean. China had decades of accumulated knowledge of every port, every wind pattern, every diplomatic relationship from the Persian Gulf to the East African coast. China had the wealth to sustain a permanent naval presence across the entire Indian Ocean basin. It had demonstrated, in 7 voyages, between 1405 and 1433, that it could project power to the furthest reaches of the network without conquest and without the destruction that conquest entails. And then it stopped. The charts were burned, the shipyard fell into ruin, and 60 years later, 4 small Portuguese ships rounded Africa and changed the world, in part because the power that might have stopped them had chosen, for reasons that seemed rational at the time, to look the other way. Zheng voyages are remembered today as a historical curiosity, a road not taken, a what-if of planetary scale. But they were not merely an episode. They were the clearest demonstration the pre-modern world produced of what a state-backed Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean world could have looked like: engaged, powerful, and in contrast to what followed, conducted without the systematic violence that would characterize the European intrusion. The sailors of Malindi and Calicut who watched Zheng fleet approach, and then, years later, watched da Gama's approach, experienced the same ocean, but 2 completely different visions of what power in that ocean could mean. The withdrawal's consequences were not only geopolitical. The destruction of the records, the burning of the charts, the erasure of the navigational knowledge accumulated over 7 voyages was an act of intellectual vandalism that the Indian Ocean world would eventually pay for in blood. The knowledge of where to go and how to get there did not disappear when the charts burned. It survived in the minds of Chinese merchants, in Arab navigational manuals, in the accumulated intelligence of the diaspora communities that continued to work the trade routes without state support. But the state capacity that might have defended the network was gone, and in its absence, the ocean waited open, ancient, and undefended for whatever came next. What came next left Lisbon in July of 1497. Portugal, in the late 15th century, was a small kingdom on the edge of Europe with approximately 1 million people and limited agricultural resources. It had no particular advantage in silk, no claim to spice production, no access to the overland routes that connected Europe to the Indian Ocean world. What it had was an Atlantic coastline, a tradition of deep-sea fishing, a crown willing to invest in maritime experimentation, and a particular combination of navigational knowledge, partly inherited from the Islamic world that had once ruled the Iberian Peninsula, partly accumulated through decades of systematic coastal exploration down the African shore. Portugal also had guns. Not more guns than anyone else, in the absolute sense, but guns mounted on ships in a configuration the broadside, with heavy artillery firing through sealed gun ports that had no equivalent anywhere in the Indian Ocean world. The cannon was the asymmetry that made everything else possible. When Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut in May 1498, he was not the first European to have dreamed of reaching India. He was simply the first to succeed by the Atlantic and African route, bypassing the Ottoman and Venetian intermediaries who had controlled Europe's access to Indian Ocean goods through the eastern Mediterranean. The voyage was a commercial mission with a military edge. Da Gama carried padrones, stone pillars, inscribed with the Portuguese royal arms, to erect as territorial markers. He carried a letter of introduction from King Manuel I. He carried trade goods that the Indian Ocean world found laughably inadequate, and he carried cannon. The trade goods failed to impress the Zamorans' court. The cannon's potential was not yet demonstrated. Da Gama returned to Lisbon with enough spice to make the voyage commercially successful, and enough intelligence about the Indian Ocean to plan what came next. What came next was not trade. It was the deliberate application of violence to seize control of a commercial system that Portugal lacked the productive capacity to participate in on equal terms. Da Gama's second voyage, in 1502, was explicitly a punitive expedition. He arrived with 20 warships. On the way to India, he stopped a large Arab pilgrim ship returning from Mecca, seized its cargo, and condemned the passengers, men, women, and children, reportedly 400 of them, to perish with the vessel as it burned. The burning took several hours. He continued to Calicut and demanded the expulsion of all Muslim merchants from the city. When the Zamorin refused, he bombarded the port for a full day, executed Brahmins he had taken hostage, mutilated their remains, and sent them ashore with a note of deliberate contempt for the Zamorin. This was not a breakdown of discipline. It was a policy, applied with deliberation. The Cartaz system, the Portuguese naval pass, formalized the violence into an extractive mechanism. Every merchant ship operating in the Indian Ocean was required to purchase a cartaz from Portuguese authorities, a document specifying the ship's route, cargo, and permitted ports of call. Ships without a cartaz were subject to seizure. Ships that carried goods prohibited by Portuguese commercial regulations, spices being the primary target, were subject to confiscation and their crews to execution. The system imposed a toll on every transaction in an ocean that had operated freely for 7 centuries. It was not technically a monopoly. The Portuguese lacked the ships and the administrative capacity to enforce it comprehensively, but it was an extortion system of sufficient reach to disrupt the network's commercial logic. Everywhere their patrols reached. The strategic vision behind the violence was articulated most clearly by Afonso de Albuquerque, the second governor of Portuguese India, who took office in 1509 and immediately began implementing a plan of breathtaking ambition. Albuquerque understood that the Indian Ocean trade network had 3 structural choke points: Aden, which controlled access to the Red Sea and the Mediterranean; Hormuz, which controlled access to the Persian Gulf; and Malacca, which controlled access to the Spice Islands. Capture all 3, and you controlled every major commercial route in the Indian Ocean. You did not need to be the most productive economy in the network. You needed only to sit on its arteries and charge for the passage of blood. Albuquerque took Goa from the Bijapur Sultanate in 1510, establishing the first permanent Portuguese territorial possession in Asia. He took Malacca in 1511 after a brief and brutal siege, expelling its Muslim merchant communities and attempting to redirect the spice trade through Portuguese channels. He captured Hormuz in 1515, placing Portugal's flag at the entrance to the Persian Gulf. He failed to take Aden, the city's defenses, and the Ottoman Empire's increasingly assertive presence in the Red Sea made that particular choke point too costly to seize. But the strategic architecture he built in a single decade transformed the Indian Ocean's political geography more fundamentally than any development since the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate 7 centuries earlier. The violence was not incidental to this project. It was the project. The Indian Ocean merchant world had operated for centuries on the principle that trade was mutually beneficial, that the costs of coercion outweighed its benefits, that trust networks were more productive than force. Portugal operated on a different principle, that the revenues of an established commercial system could be extracted by a third party with sufficient military capacity, even without any productive contribution to that system. The dhow captain who carried pepper from Calicut to Aden was not Portugal's enemy. He was Portugal's involuntary tax base. The cartaz was the mechanism of extraction. The cannon was the argument that made the cartaz irresistible. Francisco de Almeida, the first viceroy of Portuguese India, arrived in 1505 with 22 ships and a mandate to establish Portuguese control along the East African coast. He sacked Kilwa, the greatest commercial city in sub-Saharan Africa, which had never armed itself for war because it had never needed to in a matter of hours, looting its warehouses, destroying its administrative infrastructure, and leaving a garrison of Portuguese soldiers where Kilwa's merchant council had sat. He then burned Mombasa. Gold exports from the Zimbabwean interior, which had been flowing through Kilwa and Sofala at 5 to 8 tons per year before the Portuguese arrived, collapsed to less than half a ton under Portuguese management. The system that had enriched the Swahili coast for 5 centuries was dismantled in a single campaigning season. The Indian Ocean had seen pirates before. It had seen local wars, the occasional extortion of port revenues by powerful rulers, the periodic disruption of trade routes by political instability. What it had never seen was a state-organized campaign of systematic violence, directed not at any specific rival power, but at the commercial network itself, at the very act of trading outside Portuguese-authorized channels. The Zamorin of Calicut was not Portugal's enemy in any meaningful political sense. He was simply the ruler of the world's most important pepper market, and his continued ability to allow Muslim merchants to buy and sell pepper on terms that did not enrich Portugal was, from Portugal's perspective, an intolerable situation that justified bombardment, mutilation, and massacre. The theological framework that the Portuguese crown wrapped around this project deserves attention because it was not mere hypocrisy. Portugal's campaign in the Indian Ocean was officially a crusade, a continuation of the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to expel Islam from the Iberian Peninsula, extended into the ocean. Muslim merchants were not merely commercial competitors. They were, in the ideological terms of the Portuguese crown, religious enemies whose exclusion from trade was a pious act. The cartaz system explicitly prohibited certain goods from being shipped to Muslim ports. The violence inflicted on Muslim merchant ships was understood, by those who inflicted it, as religiously legitimate. The Indian Ocean trade network was, from this perspective, not a civilization to be engaged with. It was an Islamic enterprise to be dismantled. The network's response to the intrusion was not passivity. The Zamorin of Calicut built a fleet and fought. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, alarmed by the disruption of the Red Sea spice trade that funded its treasury, dispatched a naval expedition to the Indian Ocean in 1508, the first time a Mediterranean power had sent warships into the ocean since antiquity. The combined Mamluk-Gujarati fleet met the Portuguese at the Battle of Chaul in 1508 and won, killing Almeida's son. The Portuguese retaliation the following year, at the Battle of Diu in 1509, was decisive. Almeida's fleet destroyed the Allied force comprehensively, and the Mamluk expedition never returned. After Due, no coalition mounted a serious naval challenge to Portuguese dominance for decades. The network had no army. The network had just discovered what that absence meant. The Indian Ocean world that the Portuguese entered in 1498 and began systematically destroying from 1502 was not a primitive commercial backwater waiting to be opened by European enterprise. It was the most sophisticated commercial civilization the pre-modern world had produced. Self-governing, multicultural, institutionally rich, and by any standard of human welfare more productive and more peaceful than the Europe that was dismantling it. The cannon that shattered Kilwa's warehouses and burned the pilgrims on the Mecca ship did not bring civilization to the Indian Ocean. It brought the end of one. The speed of the destruction is almost more disturbing than the destruction itself. In a decade between 1498 and 1509, Portugal had gone from arriving uninvited at Calicut to controlling 3 of the ocean's 5 major choke points, destroying its greatest East African city, imposing an extraction system on every major trade route, and defeating the only conventional military force that had attempted to stop them. 7 centuries of accumulated commercial civilization, built without armies and sustained by trust, could not hold for 10 years against an adversary that recognized no obligation to play by the rules it was breaking. And yet the network survived. That is the part of the story that gets left out of the European telling, the part that says Da Gama opened the world and Albuquerque built empire and the Indian Ocean was Portugal's to command. The network survived, diminished and damaged and rerouted, but alive. Its survival is the subject of what comes next. The standard account of what happened to the Indian Ocean trade network after the Portuguese arrived runs roughly as follows. Da Gama opened the route, Albuquerque built the empire, and the ancient merchant world collapsed under European pressure. Its commerce redirected through Lisbon, its cities destroyed or subordinated, its 7 centuries of accumulated civilization dismantled in a generation. This account is not false. It is incomplete. The network did not collapse. It adapted. It rerouted. It found the gaps in Portuguese power, and there were many, and continued to function through them with a resilience that the European accounts, focused on victories and fortifications, systematically understate. The first and most fundamental fact about Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean is that it was thin. Portugal had approximately 1 million people. The Indian Ocean is 40 million square kilometers of water. The Estado de India, the Portuguese state apparatus in Asia, never had more than a few thousand soldiers deployed across a network of forts stretching from Mozambique to Macau. The Cartaz patrols covered the major sea lanes near their fortified ports. They did not cover the open ocean, the inshore routes, the rivers, the overland corridors, or the dozens of secondary ports that lay beyond the reach of their seasonal patrols. The network that adapted to Portuguese pressure had a geography many times larger than the geography the Portuguese could monitor. The Gujarati merchant community, the most commercially sophisticated and geographically dispersed trading network in the western Indian Ocean, adapted within years of the Portuguese arrival. When the Portuguese seized Malacca in 1511 and expelled its Muslim merchants, the Gujarati trading community relocated to the Sultanate of Aceh on the northern tip of Sumatra. Aceh controlled the western entrance to the Strait of Malacca and the overland crossing of the Malay Peninsula that could bypass the strait entirely. From Aceh, Gujarati merchants continued to move spices westward toward the Red Sea, using routes that Portuguese patrols could intercept only intermittently. The trade volume fell. The trade did not stop. The Red Sea remained the most important strategic gap in the Portuguese system. Albuquerque failed to take Aden in 1513, and without Aden, Portugal could not seal the strait that connected the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean world. The Ottoman Empire, which conquered Egypt in 1517 and with it the Red Sea coast, became the great power that kept the western approach to the Indian Ocean open for Muslim commerce. From the 1530s onward, the Ottomans actively contested Portuguese dominance of the western Indian Ocean, sending naval expeditions, supplying arms to Portuguese enemies, and maintaining the Red Sea as a functioning commercial corridor. Ottoman control of Aden after 1538 meant that pepper and spices continued to reach Cairo, Alexandria, and the Mediterranean markets, just as they had before Gama. The Venetians, who had lamented the Portuguese disruption of their spice supply, found, within a generation, that their supply was partially restored. The network's resilience was not only geographical, it was institutional. The trust networks, the diaspora communities, the shared commercial law, none of these were destroyed by Portuguese cannon. The Orang Kaya of the Banda Islands continued to trade with Malay, Chinese, and Arab merchants even after Portuguese forts appeared on nearby islands. The Swahili city-states, devastated by Almeida's raids in 1505, rebuilt their commercial relationships and continued to function, diminished, traumatized, but not eliminated. The merchants who survived Portuguese attacks on their ships did not retire from commerce. They changed their routes, sailed closer to shore, used smaller vessels, less visible to Portuguese patrols, and maintained the correspondence networks that kept them informed about where the Portuguese were and where they were not. The limits of Portuguese power were visible in the statistics. Portugal claimed a monopoly on the pepper trade between Asia and Europe. In practice, throughout the 16th century, the Red Sea route, which Portugal did not control, carried a substantial fraction of the pepper that reached Mediterranean markets. Scholars estimate that even at the height of Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean, somewhere between a third and a half of Asian spices reaching Europe still came through the old routes via Aden, Cairo, and Alexandria. The monopoly was real enough to disrupt the network and extract significant revenues. It was not real enough to replace the network it claimed to have superseded. Local rulers also resisted with greater coherence and duration than European sources typically acknowledge. The Zamarin of Calicut, whose city had been bombarded repeatedly by Portuguese fleets, whose Hindu priests had their ears and noses cut off and sent back in baskets, continued fighting Portugal for more than a century after da Gama's first arrival. He formed alliances with Arab merchants, corresponded with the Ottoman Sultan, contracted with Malabar pirates, and repeatedly rebuilt the commercial relationships that Portuguese raids disrupted. Calicut was never brought to permanent submission. It traded on different terms and through different channels, but it traded. Aceh, under Sultan Alauddin al-Qahar in the mid-16th century, became the most significant anti-Portuguese political force in Southeast Asia. The Sultan formed a direct diplomatic relationship with Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire, an alliance that connected the eastern end of the network with the Western Islamic power that was Portugal's most serious global rival. The Ottomans sent military advisors, artillery and naval engineers to Aceh. Achenese fleets, equipped with Ottoman cannon and advised by Ottoman technicians, repeatedly challenged Portuguese control of the Strait of Malacca. The alliance was never strong enough to dislodge the Portuguese from Malacca itself. The city's fortifications and Portuguese naval power in the strait were too robust, but it was strong enough to keep the surrounding commercial world functioning outside Portuguese control. The corruption and venality of the Portuguese colonial system also worked in the network's favor. The officers of the Estado da India were notoriously open to bribery. A cartaz that was technically prohibited could often be obtained for the right price. Goods that the official system declared monopolized continued to move through private arrangements between Portuguese officials and the merchants they were nominally supposed to exclude. The gap between the Estado's regulations and its actual enforcement was wide enough for much of the network's commerce to continue through. And the merchants who understood how to navigate that gap were precisely the kind of experienced, institutionally sophisticated traders who had been operating the network for generations. The survival of the network through the Portuguese century is not a story of heroic resistance in the face of impossible odds, though there was heroism in it. It is a story of institutional resilience, of commercial practices so deeply embedded across so many communities and geographies that no single power, however violent, could uproot them all simultaneously. The Quirad Partnership did not require Portuguese permission to operate. The Diaspora Trust Network did not require Portuguese acknowledgement to function. The monsoon continued to reverse twice a year regardless of what flags flew over the ports it connected. The network survived not because it defeated the Portuguese, but because it was more durable than any individual adversary, and because the Portuguese, for all their violence, were still too few, too thinly spread, and too dependent on the very commerce they claimed to control, to actually eliminate it. Portugal's century of violence in the Indian Ocean was, in its own terms, a commercial failure. The Estado da India cost more to maintain than it returned in spice revenues. The corruption that ran through its officer class bled the system from within. The routes it claimed to monopolize continued to function around its fortifications. By the end of the 16th century, Portugal's position in the Indian Ocean was militarily imposing and commercially compromised, an empire built on guns that had never quite succeeded in replacing the merchant world it had set out to destroy. What came next was a different kind of European power, better capitalized, more systematically organized, more willing to apply sustained institutional violence to the problem of monopoly, and possessed of a commercial ruthlessness that made the Portuguese look, by comparison, almost improvised. The Dutch Republic in 1600 was the most commercially sophisticated state in Europe. Its banking system, its joint stock company structures, its deep capital markets, and its culture of merchant-investor partnership had no equivalent anywhere in the world. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was founded in 1602 with a charter that gave it the power of a state, the right to make war, conclude treaties, establish colonies, and maintain armies, exercised on behalf of its shareholders rather than its king. The VOC was not a company that traded. It was a company that governed. And what it proposed to govern was the spice trade of the Indian Ocean, monopolized and controlled with a thoroughness that the Portuguese had attempted and failed to achieve. The difference between Portuguese and Dutch colonial strategy in the Indian Ocean was not a difference of degree. It was a difference of kind. Portugal had tried to tax the network from the outside to impose a pass system on merchants who continued to do business more or less as before, extracting a portion of revenues without fundamentally restructuring the production and distribution of goods. The VOC proposed something more radical, the elimination of the independent merchant networks themselves, replaced by a system in which the VOC controlled production directly, determined prices by fiat, and destroyed any competitive supply that it could reach. This was not mercantilism in the usual sense. It was the deliberate destruction of an alternative commercial civilization in order to create a monopoly in its place. The VOC arrived in the Indian Ocean with superior capital, superior naval organization, and a strategic clarity about what it wanted that the Portuguese had never quite achieved. It was also operating in a world that the Portuguese had already weakened. The Swahili city-states had been devastated. The Gujarati merchant networks were operating under persistent disruption. The Malacca entrepot was gone, its functions distributed among dozens of smaller ports, none of which had the institutional weight of the original. The VOC did not arrive in the Indian Ocean world that Gama had found in 1498. It arrived in the damaged, adapting, partially dismantled world that a century of Portuguese violence had produced, and it was better equipped than Portugal had been to finish the work. The Banda Islands were the clearest expression of the VOC's logic. These 10 small islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago produced essentially all of the world's nutmeg and mace. They had been doing so for centuries, trading with Malay, Chinese, Arab, and Javanese merchants through a system of open commerce in which the orang kaya, the wealthy merchant elders, negotiated prices and terms on behalf of their communities. The VOC wanted a monopoly on nutmeg. The orang kaya would not give it. In 1621, Governor-General Jan Peter June Cohen landed on the largest island with 1,600 soldiers and 250 Japanese mercenaries. In the weeks that followed, more than 10,000 Bandanese were killed, enslaved, or driven off their islands. The orang kaya were executed, their fate displayed publicly as a warning. The islands were repopulated with Dutch plantation managers and imported slave labor. The nutmeg monopoly was secured. The Banda Islands had been a functioning society for centuries. In 1621, they ceased to be one. Cohen's approach to the spice trade extended beyond the Banda Islands. He established Batavia, present-day Jakarta, as the VOC's administrative capital in 1619, burning the existing city of Jayakarta to the ground to build it. From Batavia, he directed a systematic campaign to control every major spice-producing area in the Indonesian archipelago. Cloves were monopolized through the domination of Ternate and Tidore. Pepper was regulated through a network of forced delivery contracts that obliged local rulers to supply the VOC at fixed prices. The independent maritime commerce of the archipelago, the dense web of Malay, Javanese, Chinese, and Bugis trading networks that had connected the Spice Islands to the Indian Ocean for centuries, was targeted explicitly. Ships trading outside VOC authorization were seized. Villages that sold to unauthorized buyers were burned. The VOC's campaign against the Indian Ocean's independent merchant communities was more systematically successful than Portugal's had been, because it operated at a fundamentally different scale of capital and organization. The Portuguese Estado da India had been chronically underfunded, its corruption a structural feature rather than a deviation from policy. The VOC deployed the capital of thousands of Dutch investors, managed through accounting systems of genuine sophistication, directed by a board of directors in Amsterdam that could sustain campaigns across decades without the fiscal crises that had perpetually hampered the Estado. The VOC could and did maintain fleets in the Indian Ocean that dwarfed anything the Portuguese had deployed. In the 1640s and 1650s, it expelled the Portuguese from Ceylon, from Malacca, and from their East African strongholds with a military thoroughness that the Portuguese crown, by that point absorbed by Spain and exhausted by its own global overextension, could not resist. The network's surviving nodes fell one by one to Dutch pressure. The Banda massacre was the most extreme expression of the VOC's method, but it was not an anomaly. The clove-producing islands of the northern Moluccas were subjected to a policy of systematic destruction, the VOC's Hongi raids, in which armed fleets annually toured the islands, destroying any clove trees not registered in the VOC's production system, enforcing the monopoly through the destruction of supply. The effect on the communities that had depended on clove cultivation for centuries was catastrophic. The Dutch were not disrupting a trade, they were dismantling an ecology. By the mid-17th century, the great Indian Ocean merchant world that had operated freely from the 8th century to the early 16th was effectively broken. Not destroyed, the bones of it persisted in the diaspora communities, the Swahili language, the Islamic practice of Indonesia, the Gujarati commercial culture that had relocated to Surat and would eventually find its way into partnership with the English East India Company. But the self-governing, stateless, trust-based commercial civilization that had connected half the planet without coercion was gone. In its place was a system of colonial extraction managed by joint stock companies backed by state power, a different thing entirely, with different values, different beneficiaries, and a different theory of what commerce was for. The irony that the VOC was itself a form of commercial innovation, that the joint stock company structure that made it possible was, in part, derived from the Islamic commercial traditions that the network had transmitted westward into Europe through the Mediterranean trade, is not lost on careful historians. The Comenda contract that the Arab merchant world had developed in the pre-Islamic period and systematized under Islamic law had reached Italy through the Venetian and Genoese traders who bought spices in Alexandria. The Venetians had refined it. The Dutch had transformed it into the world's first true joint stock company. The commercial civilization that the VOC destroyed had, in a profound sense, provided the intellectual and institutional raw material for the instrument of its own destruction. There is a question worth asking about the Indian Ocean trade network that historians have been slow to ask directly. The network was not secret. It was not obscure. For 7 centuries, it moved the goods that furnished the courts of 3 continents, spread the religion that today claims nearly 2 billion adherents, transmitted the mathematical and navigational knowledge that made the European age of exploration possible, and generated the commercial practices that, filtered through Italian merchants and Dutch investors, became the financial architecture of the modern world. It was the most consequential economic system the pre-modern world produced, and yet most people who receive a Western education have never heard of it. The question is why? The answer is not accidental. The first mechanism of erasure was military. When the Portuguese destroyed the merchant cities of the Swahili coast and imposed the Cartaz system on the Indian Ocean, they were not only seizing revenues, they were dismantling the institutional infrastructure of a commercial civilization. The records of Kilwa's merchant councils, the legal documents of the Gujarati diaspora communities, the commercial correspondence networks that had connected the Indian Ocean world for centuries, all of this was disrupted, dispersed, or destroyed by a century of Portuguese violence and institutional replacement. The VOC continued the process, eliminating the independent merchant communities of the Indonesian archipelago and replacing their commercial culture with a plantation economy run by European managers and enslaved labor. By the time the colonial system was fully in place, the physical evidence of what had preceded it was buried under 3 centuries of European administrative documentation. The second mechanism was historiographical. The European powers that destroyed the Indian Ocean merchant world wrote the history of the ocean they had conquered. Portuguese chroniclers like João de Barros celebrated da Gama's voyage as the opening of the world, framing the merchant cities he had terrorized as primitive, their commerce as disorder waiting to be regulated, their resistance as fanaticism waiting to be overcome. Dutch merchants and officials produced an equally self-serving account of the spice trade, one in which the VOC appeared as the rational organizer of a chaotic market rather than as the systematic destroyer of a functioning commercial civilization. The historical record that reached European universities, and through European universities the entire global academy, was written by the people who had done the destroying. The historiographical framework that emerged from this literature had a specific structure. It began with European maritime expansion as the founding moment of the global economy, the point at which the world became connected. Everything before that moment was, by implication, local, primitive, or, at best, regional. The Silk Road got a mention as a precursor, described in terms that emphasized its exoticism and fragility. The Indian Ocean trade network was occasionally acknowledged in footnotes about the commodities that attracted European interest: pepper, cloves, nutmeg, without any sustained account of the civilization that had produced and distributed those commodities for centuries. Africa's role in the network was the most thoroughly erased. The Swahili city-states were described, when described at all, as dependent outposts of Arab commerce, rather than as the autonomous, sophisticated commercial civilization they had been. The erasure of Africa from the Indian Ocean story was particularly systematic. European colonial historiography needed Africa to be primitive, not merely for the moral convenience of the slave trade, but for the intellectual coherence of the civilizing mission. If East Africa had been, before European contact, deeply integrated into the world's most sophisticated commercial system, if the cities that the Portuguese burned had been centers of mercantile culture comparable to anything in the Mediterranean world, then the foundational claim of European colonialism, that it was bringing civilization to places that had none, could not be sustained. The erasure was therefore not merely historical negligence. It was structural necessity. A civilization that had to be destroyed needed, after the fact, to be described as though it had never existed. The same logic applied, with different emphasis, to the Indian Ocean world's technological and intellectual contributions. The mathematical system that Europe calls Arabic numerals, which is an Indian invention, transmitted westward through Arab commercial networks, was acknowledged as Arabic and then quietly Europeanized through the work of Fibonacci and the Italian merchant mathematicians who adopted it. The navigational techniques that Portuguese explorers used to reach India based in part on Arab astronomical traditions, transmitted through the Iberian Muslims whose civilization Portugal had spent centuries suppressing, were described as European achievement. The commercial instruments that the Dutch used to fund the VOC joint stock companies, bills of exchange, credit partnerships, were framed as Dutch or Italian innovations, with the Islamic commercial tradition from which they derived remaining in the historiographical shadows. The recovery of the Indian Ocean world's history is a project that is still underway. The scholarly reassessment began in earnest in the mid-20th century, with figures like K.N. Chowdhury, whose 1985 work Trade and Civilization in the Indian Ocean established the network as an object of serious historical study. S.D. Goitein's analysis of the Cairo-Geniza documents, the commercial correspondence of Jewish merchants active in the 11th and 12th centuries, revealed the operational sophistication of the medieval trade in extraordinary detail, overturning the image of a primitive pre-colonial commerce. The work of scholars like Abdul Sharif on the Swahili coast, Ashin Das Gupta on Gujarati merchants, and Janet Abulugad on the pre-European world system collectively constructed a picture of the medieval Indian Ocean that bore no resemblance to the primitive backdrop of European expansion that colonial historiography had imagined. But scholarly recovery is slow, and the cultural inertia of the received narrative is enormous. The story of the world that most people carry, the story that begins with Greece and Rome, passes through the medieval European church, reaches its first global moment with Columbus and Gama, and then follows the European empires as the primary agents of world history, leaves almost no space for a 7th-century commercial civilization that was self-governing, multicultural, and institutionally sophisticated beyond anything Europe could match in the same period. Not because the evidence is missing. The evidence has been there all along. The Swahili ruins of Kilwa, listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1981, are visible on a Tanzanian island to anyone who travels there. The Cairo-Geniza correspondence is preserved and translated. Ibn Battuta's accounts of the cities he visited are available in every major library. The history was not lost. It was not looked for because the structure of the story that European civilization told about itself had no place for it. The cost of that omission is not only historical, it is political in the deepest sense. The modern world's understanding of where economic development comes from, of what conditions make complex commercial systems possible, of what the relationship between commerce and state power has been across human history. All of this is distorted by the absence of the Indian Ocean world from the canonical account. The network demonstrated for 7 centuries that sophisticated long-distance trade was possible without conquest, without coercion, and without the state-backed violence that European commercial expansion required. That demonstration was suppressed, not because it was false, but because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging what was done to the civilization that made it. The story of how the world became connected, how goods, ideas, technologies, and faiths moved across the pre-modern globe belongs, overwhelmingly, to the Indian Ocean. The story of how that connectivity was dismantled, monopolized, and reframed as European achievement belongs to the 4 centuries that followed. To tell both stories honestly, in their full complexity, is not to diminish European history. It is to restore the history that European expansion suppressed and to give back to the merchants of Calicut, Kilwa, Aden, and Malacca the credit that Da Gama's arrival stole from them along with their pepper. The Indian Ocean trade network ended as a self-governing commercial civilization somewhere in the 17th century, when the VOC finally secured monopoly control over the major spice-producing regions and the last independent merchant networks were either absorbed into the colonial system or driven to its margins. The physical world the network had built, the port cities, the mosques, the merchant houses, the weighing halls, was partially destroyed, partially converted to European colonial use, and partially left to the slow work of time and vegetation. Kilwa Kisiwani, the greatest commercial city in sub-Saharan Africa, is today an island of coral ruins and a small fishing community. A UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by tourists who are rarely told with any precision what was destroyed there in 1505 and why. But the network's ending was not the end of what it had made. Civilizations do not dissolve cleanly. They leave residues in languages, in faiths, in commercial practices, in the genetic and cultural makeup of the communities that carry their inheritance forward through the centuries that follow. The Indian Ocean trade network's residues are everywhere in the modern world, distributed across half the planet in ways that the canonical story of European discovery and colonization has systematically obscured. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim-majority country on Earth, with more than 200 million adherents. Not one of them is Muslim, because an Arab army conquered their ancestors. Indonesia became Muslim through the slow, commercially driven permeation of Islamic practice that began when Arab and Gujarati merchants settled in Sumatran port cities in the 13th century and continued, community by community, conversion by conversion, for 200 years. The faith that shapes the daily lives of 250 million Indonesians is the direct legacy of the Indian Ocean trade network of the monsoon that carried those merchants, of the commercial framework that made their settlement attractive, of the mosques they built, and the legal traditions they embedded in the fabric of port city life. Kiswahili is spoken today as a first or second language by more than 200 million people across East Africa, from Kenya and Tanzania to Uganda, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and beyond. It is the most widely spoken African language on the continent. Its grammar is Bantu. Its vocabulary carries the full weight of the Indian Ocean world. Arabic words for commerce, for religion, for administration, for navigation. Persian words for the goods that moved through the network. Even Portuguese words acquired through the violence of the 16th century. Kiswahili is, in its very structure, an archive of the civilization that produced it. Every sentence spoken in Swahili is a trace of the world that the monsoon built. The Gujarati merchant communities that animated the Indian Ocean network from the 10th century onward survived the Portuguese century, adapted to the VOC era, and eventually partnered with the English East India Company to maintain their position in what became the British-dominated Indian Ocean commercial system. Their descendants form some of the most commercially sophisticated communities in the modern world in Kenya, in Tanzania, in South Africa, in the United Kingdom, in the United States. The Tata family, whose industrial empire shaped modern India, traces its roots to the Parsi merchants of Gujarat, whose ancestors were among the most active participants in the medieval Indian Ocean trade. The commercial culture that the network created did not vanish when the network's institutional structure was dismantled. It persisted in the families and practices of the communities that had embodied it. The spice trade itself, the commerce in pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg that was the Indian Ocean world's most lucrative and most fought-over product, left its mark on the global food system in ways that are visible in every kitchen. The cloves in Indonesian cuisine, the cardamom in South Asian tea, the pepper in the world's most commonly used spice blend. These are the biological traces of a commercial world that connected the Banda Islands to Cairo and the Malabar coast to the Mediterranean for 7 centuries before anyone in Portugal had thought to round the Cape. The flavors of the modern world are, in significant part, the flavors of the Indian Ocean network's commerce. The mathematical and financial infrastructure of the modern world carries the network's intellectual legacy in forms so thoroughly absorbed that their origin has become invisible. The decimal system, the concept of zero, the algebra that underlies engineering, physics, and economics, the credit instruments, bills of exchange, letters of credit, partnership contracts that were standard practice in the Islamic merchant world centuries before they appeared in the Italian merchant manuals that European financial history credits with their invention. The joint stock company itself, the fundamental institutional innovation of modern capitalism, was built on commercial practices whose deepest roots reach into the pre-Islamic Arabian caravan trade and were systematized by Islamic jurisprudence into the Qirad contract. The modern financial world did not invent these tools. It inherited them through channels that the received history of finance has preferred not to trace. The monsoon itself continues to reverse twice a year over the Indian Ocean, as it has for millions of years. As indifferent to the centuries of violence and commerce and erasure that have played out on the water beneath it, as it was when the first Austronesian outrigger used it to cross from Borneo to Madagascar. Modern container ships carrying Chinese electronics, Indian textiles, and Saudi oil move through the same waters on routes that follow, at some level, the same geographical logic that the dhow captains of the 10th century understood. The Indian Ocean is still the world's commercial center. Its infrastructure is now steel and diesel rather than teak and coconut rope, and it is governed by state navies rather than by monsoon seasons and merchant reputation. But it remains what it was, the water that connects the most populous and productive parts of the planet to one another. What was lost when the network was destroyed is harder to measure than what survived, because what was lost was not a commodity, or a language, or a mathematical system. What was lost was a way of organizing large-scale human cooperation that did not require coercion, a proof that complex, multicultural, multi-ethnic, continent-spanning commerce was possible without conquest, without the monopolization of violence, without the state standing behind every contract with a sword. The network had demonstrated this for 7 centuries. Its destruction did not prove the demonstration false. It simply replaced the demonstration with a different model, one in which the revenues of global commerce flowed to those who could enforce monopoly through military power, rather than to those who could build the trust networks that made commerce possible in the first place. Whether a world organized on the Indian Ocean model on trust, shared law, and the physics of wind rather than on conquest and coercion was sustainable in the long run, whether it would have remained peaceful and self-governing as the volume of trade increased and the stakes of commercial competition rose, is a question history was not allowed to answer. The cannon arrived before the question could be put to the test. What we know is what the network achieved before the cannon arrived. 7 centuries of connected civilization, an ocean full of dhows, and a commercial world that was, by any honest measure, more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan, and more at peace with itself than the Europe that destroyed it. The ocean remembers this, even when the history books do not.